Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And this week we are going to do part two of our series on Augustus. And he was one of the longest ruling emperors, and we figured that, it was impossible to do in just one episode. So we decided to split this in two, where last week we focused on the rise of Augustus, better known as Octavian at the time, and we ended at the Battle of Actium. And this week we're going to continue forth from Battle of Actium and of course to the end of Augustus' life. And we are of course once again joined by Lindsay, Powell. And last time he was on, we discussed Tiberius. We also discussed Marcus Agrippa. We did another two-part series on the Julio-Claudian dynasty. We are also done Germanicus, which was the first episode is he debuted on this podcast on, and he's one of the most returning guests on the podcast so far. I think is definitely one of the top five most returned guests, and we love having her. Welcome back, and let's leave where we left off the last time, and that was of course Mark Antony and Cleopatra running away to Egypt. And I want to begin the focus on the demise of Cleopatra and Mark Antony because that of course is as well kind of important to the story.
Indeed. So on the 3rd of September 31 BC, dawn, Octavian basically claimed victory for Actium. And they'd watched him, Agrippa, the rest of his commanders, Cleopatra and Antonius sail away from the battle the day before. And rather than going after them, giving chase to
Mm.
the guys in flight, Agrippa decided to keep the battle in the Ionian Sea to basically uh, neuter the fleet and the army. And what that meant was that when Antony and Cleopatra and they sort of arrive at their destinations separately, it's a debacle. I mean, they don't have their fleet anymore. Cleopatra's got her few ships plus her treasury. Antony tries to, I think, land to get uh, what would I just say? Help from allies on the coast of Africa, but basically is turned away. So finally makes it to Egypt. And really, these two formerly very wealthy, influential, highly resourced individuals are completely distraught because you think about it, they've left their army, they've left their fleet. What have they got left? She has somewhat of an army still in Egypt. He doesn't have anything. And they know that within the year, Octavian and his land army are going to arrive and they're going to want to settle and finally defeat the two antagonists. So, in the year that passes between September of 31 going all the way through to the summer of 30, there's a lot of, I would imagine, wound licking on the side of Antonius and Cleopatra as they try and work out what they're going to do in the full knowledge that the war isn't over and that their arch enemy is coming down the coast of the Levant. And sure enough, that's what happens. They show up. And one of the things that Octavian would love to be able to do is simply capture the queen, capture his opponent, and basically put them in a triumph, or at least with Antonius, I guess, would be to try him for sedition, treason, and all the other things that would go with being a rebel of the Roman state. But they don't get the chance. It's very interesting. So this game of standoff and politicking takes place over the several ensuing months, and Cleopatra is a queen whose primary objective is to look after the interests of her dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty. It's a Greek Macedonian dynasty, and to retain the integrity of the Kingdom of Egypt, which is by far the wealthiest part of the known Roman world. And she is the last of the Ptolemies, and of course, she can either try and work it such that she cuts a diplomatic deal with Octavian that she can continue in that role and accommodate for his needs, or she has to go down fighting. And it's very interesting when you read the ancient stories in the sources. She engages in active diplomacy. It's not a case of Antony fields an army, Octavian beats them, and then they commit suicide. That there is a lot of toing and froing between the two sides. Um, it gets to the point where Octavian is effectively able to convince the remnants of Antony's army to come onto his side, which means that you've got to. I think there's a scene, and it was beautifully put together in Antony and Cleopatra with
Mm.
Richard Burton. You may remember the scene where Richard Burton, as Antony, is riding in this horse, and he basically doesn't have an army anymore, and he rides up to the lines of troops under Octavian and tries to get them to fight. And they won't do it because they see the futility of this thing, the humiliation of this man who has a great name in Roman society. I mean, Marcus Antonius was a man of some note and worth, but he's disgraced. He's completely without an army, a means to be able to impose his will anymore. And the question is, how is it going to end for him? Well, it ends finally where the negotiations with the Queen and Octavian uh, reach an impasse. So I think it's fair to say that he wants her to surrender, and I don't think she's prepared quite to do that. And there's a misunderstanding in the process of this dialogue where Antony, who's besotted, of course, with his queen, uh, is led to believe that she has actually committed suicide and is dead. And of course, then takes his own life. And then the famous scene, of course,
Mm.
that she appears, and then it's discovered that in
Of
fact
course,
he's dying.
Shakespeare's been on the scene as
Yes,
well.
and it's sometimes very hard because it is such a powerful story that William Shakespeare wrote in the late 16th century, 17th century, that it's hard sometimes to take those images because he did so well with the sources that he did,
Yeah.
the Plutarchs and so on of this world. Bottom line is that Antonius takes his own life, which leaves the
Yeah.
queen on her own now, and the
It's
question
kind
then
of a
becomes,
Romeo and Juliet-esque death in a way that were similar, where it kind of reminds a bit of the final scene of Romeo and Juliet in a way, the death of Antony and
well,
Cleopatra.
so there is a cult sort of like way of noble Romans taking their own lives through suicide, or at least
Yeah,
assisted suicide in some cases, rather than being captured. And there's a sort of tolerance, I think, in Roman society that it's a bit like you see sometimes in movies again. Sorry, go back to movies where the general is given the gun with one bullet. We'll
yeah.
be back in 5 minutes sort of thing. And I think there's an acceptance, but there's also, by the way, I think it's also fair to say that in Roman law, this is what I remember from my research and in writing about Tiberius, if the person accused took their own life, their assets from their estates, their legacy would pass to their children. If you did not do that, you put your estate at risk of confiscation. So there's a case to be argued by doing what he did. Not only did he save the greater humiliation of being captured, and who knows what his fate might have been after that, um, but his children get to keep the stuff, right? And I think that maybe is another dimension to this discussion of why Romans commit suicide in these pretty gory but uh, accepted ways for their society. So Antonius then basically is dead at this point, and this is we're talking 31
Mm.
so 30 BC, so a year after Actium. And the queen is faced with the dilemma now. I mean, her principal Roman ally is now gone. She now has to negotiate directly with effectively the man in charge, effectively an autocrat, with an army. I mean, this he can impose his will because it has an army, and it seems to be they negotiate what they're going to do. And she wants to keep a kingdom. He's not so sure she can do that, but he basically Octavian at this point wants her to surrender to him. And I think a deal is cracked when they can do something along those lines, but she cheats him by again committing suicide. The famous story with the asp. In a number of interpretations, scientific papers which say that the bite of an asp, in fact, is not going to kill you. So was it in fact an asp? Might it have been another kind of snake, or it may have been just a story that's put out because it's a very sort of romantic story. It's a dramatic one. It's a sort of heroic one in its own way. She may have just taken poison. She may have been assassinated. I seem to recall, I think Adrian Goldsworthy floats the idea in his book that in fact it might have been a political assassination. Much as you could put it this way, much as Octavian might have wanted to put her in triumph in Rome, and don't forget in 44 BC and before, she was actually in Rome and she had actually done a parade of Egyptian. to the Roman people. So she was not a stranger to this. But on the other hand, I mean, then what do you do with this person afterwards?
Yeah.
So, in fact, by disposing of her like that could be politically expedient. And once she is dead, one of the first things that Octavian does is he hunts down the children. He takes Caesarion and has him killed, and the other two basically allowed to live, but very much not as heirs of Cleopatra, because at that point Octavian takes the kingdom of Egypt.
Now, I'm going to go back a little bit as well because we don't talk. I just wanted to make sure we got the ending of Cleopatra and Antony as well, of course, but in the picture so they weren't totally wiped out. But I mean they were, but for the episode's sake. But let's go back then and talk about Augustus or Octavian, rather still. And his return to Rome after the Battle of Actium, and of course he how popular is he at this point in Rome? And he does sound he's kind of won. There is still kind of a phony war in a sense at this point. How does he still hold a Roman triumph? And how does he, how is he welcome? How is he welcomed back to Rome and Roman
Well,
society after the Battle of Actium?
Well, I think actually he goes to Athens.
Mm,
Let me quickly check that. He actually he requires Agrippa to take the troops that are basically demobbed now from Antony's side. He keeps some of them, but the great majority are actually demobbed, and Agrippa has to take them back to Italy and find them places to live, basically. He understands that it's better to have surrendered troops feel good that their service was appreciated, that they are Roman citizens. There will not be any consequences for them negatively, and by creating a pool of goodwill through the army and the veterans, he hopes to be able to create a lobby, if you will, which will back him. I mean, they treated him well, so they look after him as it were. So I think what happens is he goes to Athens, and then this is from there he leads his army down the coast the following year. Because you've got to remember, in September, you're then going into October, and now the so-called shipping lanes in the Mediterranean start to shut down because we're going
mm,
into the late fall and winter. So he uses that time to organize himself and plan his army. How was he felt in Italy? Well, my understanding is that Agrippa goes back there, right? So Agrippa is the ambassador, is the spokesman
mm,
for his boss, Octavian. And you can imagine, don't forget that the year before, the Senate and the Italian nation was required to swear an oath of allegiance to Octavian. So the answer effectively is our man fulfilled the mission, right? He got the
yeah.
work done. He did the job. And so in that regard, I would imagine there's a sense of relief
Mm,
that, okay, the situation has, Italy has not been invaded. The Queen has been chased away, and the
mm,
risk to Italy has now been repulsed. And the hope is that some kind of settled existence will return to Italy. Because you have to remember, there are going to be people who've been alive at the time of the civil war after Julius Caesar's death, and going all the way through to this new one, which will be the Actian War. So some people have only ever seen war during their lifetime would love that not to be the case anymore. So the hope is that Octavian, having won Actium and now preparing himself for ending the whole conflict
mm.
completely in
I mean,
Egypt, would be seen as a
in
good thing.
in a way, Actium is kind of the final battle because Mark Antony, and as we discussed, Mark Antony and Cleopatra doesn't really do much in Egypt, and he's kind of a phony war until their death in a way. So it's in a way the Battle of Actium is kind of the final stand. They didn't know this, of course, at the time, but from hindsight, kind of is the final stand that would define the rest of the Roman Empire history.
Yeah, so they actually they reach Pelusium, which is considered to be an important point in the Egyptian Delta, and effectively that I think from the point of a military exercise represents something of a Rubicon, if you like. When you get there,
Yeah.
you're entering Egypt, and basically with the death of the Queen. Octavian now has access to all the wealth of Egypt. Don't forget, he's got a lot of creditors in
Yeah.
in Rome and Italy that have financed his war. So a lot of the money is now owed those people, and in order for him to establish his standing in is to settle his debt. So he's going to do that. In fact, when you look at what the army, of course, there's an enormous Roman army now in Egypt, and that could be a problem pretty
Mm.
soon. They've got to be fed and they've got to be kept occupied. A couple of legions are kept in Egypt, and they will be there for several hundred years. They build a canal. I think that's one of the big projects they have. So they get working on things. There are some inscriptions showed that there was civil engineering works and so forth. And ultimately, Octavian goes back to Rome. And what's very significant is that he plans for 29 BC to be an important year. And in 29 BC, he's in the meantime, by the way, instructed work on the temple to divine Julius, Templum Divus Julius, to be built and finished. And the reason for that, and oh, by the way, also the Curia Julia, which was the Julian Senate house, which actually wasn't finished at the time of Julius Caesar's assassination and got burned down after that. So they finished the two big buildings that at the one end of the forum beneath the Capitol Hill, right next to where nowadays we see the Arch of Septimius Severus is that big tall building, which is the Curia Julia. That's finished in
Mm.
29. And at the other end of the forum is the Temple of Divine Julius, where there is an indent with a big pile of bricks and stones, which you could still see, which is the place where Julius Caesar's body was burned. And that became a sanctified spot. It's still there. You know, you can actually go look at it, and a lot of people still throw flowers at it. It's quite remarkable. And in fact, what Octavian wanted to do was to arrive in Rome over 3 days and have what was is now called the Triple Triumph. And this was the triumph to end all triumphs. It was 3 days back to back, and the point about this really was to be able to celebrate the great victories that Octavian had. So you have to remember, before Actium, he'd actually been very active in Illyricum, which is further up the coast. He was defeating, there was a revolt of the Pannonians and the Dalmatians, Scordisci, and so other people. He had spent time with Agrippa, and in fact, he had himself been wounded. He'd led some active campaigns and he'd been wounded personally, so he had battle scars, and that was one day. The other day was the Actian War, and then finally the Alexandrian War. So they thought of Actium and Alexandrian as two different things. And what he was able to do was to parade all of the trophies and spoils, the captives. So in fact, I think it's the final day when the Alexandrian War is celebrated, and yeah, Rome turns out for this amazing event. It starts probably at the Via Appia and winds its way through the city and ends up on the Via Sacra in the Roman Forum before going up to the Capitoline Hill. There is him in a chariot, and there are his young stepsons. So, for example, Tiberius and young Drusus are actually in the on the chariot, or actually on the horses, and they're all the members of the family, all sort of getting the halo effect of this amazing event. And in the procession, amongst all the jewels and the piles of shields and spears and body armor and so forth, there are placards explaining what these are from, or models of towns that the Roman army has, scuppered, and then the rostra of the ships from the Battle of Actium. And in fact, they will ultimately end up as part of the decoration, the monuments of the city itself. And then the captives, many of whom are family members of Cleopatra. And it's an extraordinary event because this is what the most successful of Rome's generals crave to have as a triumph. It's a moment where they become almost close to Jupiter in terms of their power in the eyes of other people, in the way that they're viewed as being fully achieved human beings, if you like, men who have achieved their potential. And those 3 days, the Triple Triumph, are extraordinary because at the same time, you've now got the new temple opened, you've got the Senate House opened, and what you see is that the actual Roman Forum itself, over time, is transformed partly into a celebration of Octavian's victories. right? And it's really interesting when you think that, the public speakers platform, the rostrum, which is just outside the Curia Julia, has these great big bronze rams from the ships. So these are captured spoils from war relics. Imagine this. It's interesting to contemplate these things. That after the Second World War, the square outside the Houses of Parliament near Westminster Cathedral had a sort of speakers platform where we put cannons and guns, like tank guns, right, from the captured German army, or something like that. And we would think of that as being somewhat distasteful. Right, those
Mm.
things belong in a museum, or they belong maybe on the battlefield or somewhere, but we don't really make a big celebration of captured stuff and put it in our cities to
Mm.
sort of ogle at. But the Romans did. It's part of the way they do it. Coins come out. Octavian creates this wonderful series. I say wonderful because the beauty of the actual coins themselves with images of the rostra of a ship with a trophy on the top, or for example, a winged victory, or various other kind of images evoking his success. And what he's basically saying is that I have established in the days since I became Caesar, the heir to Julius Caesar, who had his own military background, Gaul and the battle against Pompeius Magnus and so on, that he has established his own credibility as an imperator, right? As commander.
Yeah.
And he has done this over a whole series of campaigns and years and has defeated the richest nation in the world at this time, which is Egypt. So, over those 3 days, he establishes his credentials, and there will never ever be a triumph like that. There will be other triumphs for sure, for hundreds of years, but none will actually be 3 days, one after the other, with this level of glitz and glamour and ticker tape type parade. And again, it's part of the story establishing a narrative of victory in the public's eyes. You've got to remember, in his Res Gestae, his achievements, which is one of the last documents he ever writes, and it survives in pretty much word for word now. He actually makes the point that peace, pax, was secured by victory. In other words, in his view of the world, there could be no victory unless the enemy was captured and surrendered, totally surrendered. And it's a very different view of the way that we think of peace, right? I mean,
Mm.
so Germany at the end of the Second World War was subjected to total surrender,
Yeah.
unconditional surrender. And we have a president right now who's articulated that Iran must also engage in total surrender in order for the end of the war to be. So these are echoes of this idea of peace, less a negotiated one, rather one at the end of a spear and a sword. And that's the way he defined peace. And with that, he draws a line basically under the past. So Julius Caesar's liberators, as they would have called themselves, the assassins, as everybody else thought of them, they had been dealt with. They had been basically hunted down, and justice had been served. Mission accomplished. And in the other areas where Octavian had established himself in Illyricum, in Greece, and in Egypt, he established that he'd also won those battles. And at this point, uh, you have to wonder what on earth is he going to do because he spent, don't forget, he was like 18, 19 in 44, right, when he'd actually
Mm.
taken on the mantle of being heir and avenger to Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
And now we're talking 29. So he spent most of those years fighting with his
Yeah.
partner Agrippa and several others who actually went on to be great companions and commanders in their own right. And what's he going to do? And I think this is one of the interesting things. He has to sort of decide what is his role in the Roman Republic now. And I'm sure there were lots of discussions. And in fact, if you go to Cassius Dio, I think there's in there a series of created discussions or conversations between, I think, Agrippa and Octavian and Maecenas. And the idea is that, well, what kind of world are we trying to build? And although what is in Cassius Dio is not verbatim what was said, you can imagine that there were conversations. Because remember, last time we were talking
Yeah.
about how Octavian loved to have his friends around him to talk about what are we going to do about this? What's the best deal? And it would seem to be what they discussed, or at least what came out of whatever was discussed, was that he must have a prominent position in the Roman Republic. And it can't be king and it can't be dictator, but it has to be like the number one. and they are faced with the dilemma. So in 27, so 2 years later, about a year and a half after the triumphs, uh, they meet, or at least Octavian meets, presumably the consuls and a group of senior senators, and they thrash out a deal. And modern historians call this the first constitutional settlement. They didn't call it that then, but the point is they reach a deal. And in the histories that we have, Cassius Tacitus, others, is that the basis of which is that Octavian surrenders the army and his powers. He said, I'm giving it back to you. I have achieved what I set out to do. The Republic has been restored. The Senate's back in charge. The people are voting. It's time for me to put my arms down. And the Senate responds by saying, oh, you can't possibly do that. I mean, you've saved us from civil war and blah, blah, blah. So we can't possibly have that. How about this? Why don't you take half the empire? And this will be the areas of the empire which need pacification. In other words, there's still war or revolt or something going on, and these typically are on the outer rims of the empire. So basically, all the way from the Iberian Peninsula up through northern Gaul, Germany, all the way across the Alps, and parts of the eastern side of the empire. And everything that's touching the Mediterranean effectively is peaceful, is at peace, and the Senate will control that. And effectively, this division of the empire into two types of provincial setups. His is called a provincia, which means duty in Latin. And his duty is to pacify the provinces he's given with the goal that when they are pacified, they're brought to peace. He gives them to the Senate. And the idea is that over a period of years, the man will leading this will effectively surrender most of these provinces to a Senate, which will be very grateful and will benefit greatly from the wealth and the taxation they bring in. And they agree that every 5 to 10 years they will renew his powers. So every lustrum or decennium, they basically vote in powers. And in those 5 years, he can do pretty much anything he wants to within those parts of the empire he has responsibility for. He also then delegates, because he can't do it by himself, he delegates to deputies, legati Augusti, deputies that are empowered through military means and legally in order to be able to enforce rules, regulations, and make war if necessary in their particular provinces. And in accepting that, they say, well, we must now want to recognize your greatness and your generosity. And lots of different terms are floated, one of which apparently the man Octavian liked the idea of being called Romulus, but that was poo-pooed as being that's kind of not kosher.
Mm.
And then the final title accepted was Augustus, which means the revered one. And it has hints
Was
of
our justice already a Latin word at this point, or did they just make it kind of up on the
yes.
spot?
Yes, so Augustus had been used in other contexts too. It just basically means revered one, but in this case, it became exclusively
Mm.
his. And the value of it is that it has overtones of a religious halo, a sort of sanctified dimension to it.
Yeah.
And he accepts the title. So now his name, don't forget, we started this conversation where he was Caius Octavius Turinus,
Mm.
and then he becomes Caius Julius Caesar, and then he becomes Imperator Caesar, and then he becomes Imperator Divi Caesar
Mm.
because he's the son of the god Caesar, and then now he becomes Imperator Kaiser Divi Filius Augustus,
He
and we know
dies
him for
almost
short.
worse than changing name than J.D. Vance is at this point.
Yes, I can't speak on those things, but my point is that we know him now from 27 BC as Augustus, and a lot of people will say this is where we date the start of the Roman Empire.
And
And
it's interesting also that it takes a few years after the Battle of Actium, and it comes back. It's about 3 years, I think, before he actually takes the title Augustus before the Senate. So it takes a few years as well before he finally gets the final
well,
title at this
I think what it
point.
highlights is I don't know what the plan for after the victory necessarily was. I suspect
Yeah.
that he had given great thought to it. And I remember in my research for my book, Augustus at War, there's a point, and I think it's around about 31, 30 BC, something like that, that Augustus, as we will now call him for ease of reference in the rest of this conversation, Augustus, when he is not yet the winner of the whole war, starts to make decisions of where are we going to put the legions, and he cleverly puts the legions in the periphery of what is
Yeah.
the burgeoning Roman Empire. And don't forget, there is still war going on. I mean, the Romans are still fighting in Iberia, in Cantabria, and Asturias, and those parts of Spain. The parts of northern Gaul are being attacked by German invaders. So, we tend to think about the world is revolving around Augustus and his obsessions in dealing with Cleopatra, but actually the rest of the world's still functioning as well. And what we now have with him declared as Augustus and given officially a province, and him having delegated deputies who are able to carry out this, we see now effectively a formalizing of a power structure, a relationship between the Senate and the Roman people, and him as a sort of leader. And in fact, he becomes known as Princeps. So he's effectively the Princeps Senatus, the first man. Now, he becomes a man who can convene the Senate. He can speak as a first citizen, if you will, and that gives him again. It's these are titles. These are words which carry a sort of a lot of baggage with them. And although it doesn't probably have a lot of legal weight, the fact that he is called a princeps and Augustus, and oh, by the way, in I think it's 29 or so, let's have a check here very quickly. Later, when Lepidus dies, he becomes the Pontifex Maximus, so he becomes the chief priest as well. What you find is over a period of years, he's gathering to himself some extraordinary powers and also titles. So he's regularly elected as consul, which is a constitutional position. He is then at some point, I think it's 1819 BC, he's given the powers of tribune. That means he's not actually tribune, but he's given the powers of tribune. And this means he can convene the Senate, but he can also veto any proposal that the Senate might want to put forward. So he doesn't even have to argue for or against legislation. He can just decide if the Senate says something and I don't like it, I'll just say veto in the powers given me as tribune. So you can see over a period of years, his his status in the political system and in the military power structure evolve, and he sort of creates this job. We now call it emperor, but he would not have called it emperor because it didn't exist. It was a
Imperator
sort of
isn't exactly a direct translation, right? It means kind of if you're going to do it correctly, it doesn't really mean emperor in the modern sense. Imperator just mean I mean this just is the last time that
yeah, just his commander.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's commander. So it
but the
doesn't
key is
directly mean emperor in the modern sense that we think of it as.
that's right. That idea is the grand poobah, with lots of luxury and despotism, tyranny. It is a somewhat later idea. That sort of comes around Nero and later. But I was going to say, I think the root of the word you've got to remember, imperator, is tied up with imperare and imperium, which is power. It's the power to command, right? So every magistrate that's elected for you has imperium to some degree. They're allowed a scope, a span of powers to be able to exercise during and to do their job while they're in that role. They're held accountable for it at the end, by the way. And if
Yeah.
they do bad things, they can be prosecuted. And I think we need more of that in the modern political structure. But so imperator, imperium, and these sorts of things
Yeah.
all point to this idea of having power over an
Total power. Full
well,
power.
it's total in the sense it's defined by whatever the
Yeah.
statute is. So, for example, an aedile that's responsible for things like looking over temples and the drainage and the games and these sort of things. He's responsible for those things, but he can't wander in to the legal area where the praetor does. I mean, that's a separate set of imperium over there.
So now the next topic I want to talk about is the famous line that Augustus says by the end of his life is where he says, I'm left this town, I left this town in bricks and marbles." So I don't remember the full quote, to be honest.
Yeah, I
But
found
yeah,
the city of brick. I left it one of
yeah,
marble.
I found the city of brick and left the It's at the marble, and there's a lot of building projects going on in Rome at this time. And what something we have to acknowledge, and I think we have a few times on this podcast with other guests as well, is that Rome was not necessarily a pretty town to live in. It was a dangerous city to live in before Augustus at least, and this maybe even to the end of the Roman Empire as well. But it wasn't really a nice town. If you, for example, some historians have said that if you came from Alexandria, there was this huge wide city streets and this beautiful city, but they wouldn't have been impressed if they had come to Rome. And but during Augustus' time, there's a lot of transformation going on. So let's talk about how Augustus would transform Rome. Forgive me, I'm gonna call it a shithole in a way because it kind of was, right? It was kind of a shithole in a way, but do forgive me if it's not entirely correct, but it kind of.
No,
So,
but
so
you're
let's
right.
talk
I mean,
about how we transform the city from, say, a
so
shithole into a brick of marbles.
your words. I'll say so. Rome is an interesting city. Okay, it's an organic city. It
Yeah.
evolves since the 8th century, where supposedly it was a city of seven hills, draining the swamp, the Cloaca Maxima, the development of the Forum and the Forum Boarium,
8th century
and
BC, that
people.
is.
Sorry.
8th century BC, not AD.
Yes. So the point that I'm making is that for something like 7 centuries, this set of little villages on seven hills that becomes a small town that becomes a big city, um, it doesn't have a lot of straight streets in it. It's going to have lots of winding streets as buildings are put here and put
Yeah.
there, and then the roads sort of squeezed in between. There are frequent fires. There are frequent floods. And all of this
Yeah.
causes devastation. I think it's very
And one of
interesting when
which of the fires, of course, Crustus famously earned his money from was having his own fire brigade at one point, where he would buy the property cheaply and then save it, quote unquote.
that's
That yeah,
exactly right. And so finally, when Augustus actually installs his own vigiles, which is his own fire service, it's very popular, by the way. I think that's certainly about 480. But to the point about building, so Julius Caesar, for example, had laid out when he was in Rome in 45, 46 BC. He had a lot of ideas of things. So, for example, he brought the Egyptian calendar. So Rome had a new calendar from 45 BC. He had ideas for fixing the risk of the Tiber flooding. He was going to put flood defenses in. He's going to straighten out sections of it. There were ideas for example, like he was building a new Senate house. He was expanding a fort. He built his own forum. There were going to be libraries. There were going to be lots of wonderful facilities. But you remember he died in 44 BC on the Ides of March, so he didn't have that many years to get these sorts of things out. But the plans still existed. So one of the things that you notice when you look at what Agrippa and Augustus do is that they actually finish a lot of the things that Julius Caesar tried to start. So, for example, they try and deal with some of the issues in respect of finishing the voting. So the Saepta and the Druitorium, which is the voting hall, they're all built out. The Campus Martius, which is basically a somewhat of a pasture land with a bit of swamp and so forth. It's a grazing fields where Rome's people amble about. They begin to beautify that. So Augustus builds his mausoleum. Agrippa builds his Pantheon. There are expansions and repairs done
by
to
the
the
way, one
aqueduct.
of the pantheons was, I think it was rebuilt by Hadrian. So the original pantheon you see, it's not the original pantheon you see in Rome that Agrippa built, but it's, however, the new one that Hadrian restored, right? Or I think it was
Yes,
Hadrian.
and
Yeah,
even got restored by later people after that. But you're
yeah,
absolutely right. Yes. So the Pantheon that we have around, would, by the way, was to explain to the people at home. So if you have to imagine outside of Rome, Rome at this point is basically a township crammed inside a wall that zigzags around the seven
yeah.
hills. And there's a
I mean, imagine
sprawling.
using Google Maps in that city at the time.
Right. So they call this area the Pomerium, which defines the limits of the city. And inside it's kind of sacred ground. People aren't allowed to carry weapons. The rules and regulations and how people are supposed to behave civilly. And outside that, the rules they don't apply. So the city is sprawling outside of all of this. And the needs of the city, with its growing numbers of people, high density living, the tenement blocks that you were referring to, that Crassus was involved in, rather shady fire prevention scheme. Um, so Agrippa gets into the nitty-gritty of making public infrastructure work. So the Cloaca Maxima, which had originally been built to drain the swampy marsh that we now
Yeah.
would see as being the Forum Boarium and the Forum Romanum, it was getting clogged up and it's falling into bad shape. So Agrippa, as basically the aedile for the city, he takes on the job of actually fixing the drains. I mean, it's not very glamorous, but it's very essential. That what happens is that in building the aqueducts, so there are several already at this time, but they need repairs and they leak and the water doesn't come through. There are no, how can I put it? The system in the Roman plumbing network, the fresh water network, is constantly flowing, right? It's not turned off, it's constantly flowing. So when the water comes in the aqueduct, it goes into either tanks where it's distributed out to bath buildings, which at this time are small private ones mainly, and the public fountains, of which there aren't that many. And then effectively it then goes into the drain, which then sweeps out through the Cloaca Maxa and takes everything, human filth and all the mess from the streets goes straight back into the Tiber at this point. Agrippa says we need more public water fountains, so they build masses of them. Frontinus, the head of the network that ultimately, I think under Nerva Trajan, writes about how many of these there were hundreds of these things built, and Agrippa also builds the first integrated bath structure, which is said the bath that we know the Romans are famous for, where you have a cold room and a warm
Yeah.
room and a hot room and a gymnasium. Agrippa was the guy that put all those together in the first integrated one, and that was built directly behind his Pantheon. So what you have to imagine outside of Rome on the Campus Martius is a growing collection of fabulous public entertainment buildings. And in the distance, always visible, is Augustus's mausoleum. There's a sundial which they bring over from Egypt, which is now beginning to tell the time. But so people know to tell the time, which is interesting because Julius Caesar, the heir, the adoptive father of Augustus, was the man who fixed the Roman clock. And Augustus builds this huge big clock outside his. It's called the Horologium Augusti, and there's this collection of buildings. So Agrippa builds baths. He builds this Pantheon, which originally was, by the way, going to be called the Augustium, which was really a tribute to Augustus and himself and the gods. But Augustus felt that was too much like trying to make him a god while he was alive. So he refused that. They renamed it the Pantheum, and then it's known now by its Greek name Pantheon. There was very, very close by was the great square where the Romans would go to vote in their voting tribes. There was a huge big hall called the Duratorium, which had the widest span ceilings that the Roman Empire had ever built. In fact, Pliny the Elder writes that you could still see one of these great big ceiling timbers, which had actually not been put up yet because they found they didn't need it, and people marveled at how long this thing was. It was enormous, and there was a whole ceiling supported by all of these things. So it's just amazing. What you have to see is that Augustus is turning the war dividend, the peace dividend, into public infrastructure. He issues an executive order, if I could use modern American experience, to command his deputies that when they win wars and they collect spoils and loot, some of the money from those proceeds have to go into buildings for the benefit of the public. So Rome gets new libraries, it gets a new forum, it gets a Forum Augustum, it gets a load of temples. And what Augustus also does, to going back to your point about the this terrible state that Rome was in, it's not only building new buildings, it's fixing the old ones.
Mm.
That the relationship between Romans and their gods was different than we might think. So it was more transactional. A general, for example, would go to Mars and he would set up an altar or he'd go to the official temple and say, if you bring me victory, I will build you a fabulous temple. Well, what happens is the general goes away, he wins the war, he comes back, he builds a temple. Rome gets filled with temples. The trouble is, there's often not the money after they've died to keep the temple in good shape. So Rome,
Yeah.
by the time of Augustus, has a lot of ramshackle temples with roofs with holes in and tattered and torn fabrics and tapestries and things on the inside. And in fact, one of the things that Augustus did, there was a temple to Julius Feretrius, Jupiter Feretrius, who was the god to whom the commander would take his war spoils as in gratitude. It was falling apart. The original Claudius, Marcellus Claudius, war spoils from the Gallic Wars were hanging by threads. I mean, these things were sacred items, but they'd just been let to rot. So Augustus basically does repairs. So what you see, and you have to imagine that when in the year 27, all the way through to the year where he dies in AD 14, so what is that, like 30, nearly 40 years, right? There's a constant series of either
Mm.
repairs to existing buildings or buildings being finished or buildings being built from new, from
Yeah.
scratch. So Rome is a building site, and Agrippa is right in the heart of that till from the 30s all the way through to his death in 12 BC. You've got all these generals pouring money. Some of the first stone theaters are actually built under. In fact, I think the first stone amphitheater is built by one of the generals of Augustus, and in fact, one of a stone theater was also built. So there's this huge build out, and to
Mm.
the idea that he founds a city of brick, it should be also wattle and daub and timber, is the idea that you can actually put a marble veneer on the outside and you can turn it into a building
Mm.
that's marble. So I think there's a lot of retrofitting of older buildings too with marble veneers.
Yeah.
And this
Restorations.
is all yeah. So what people find is that these buildings are made beautiful because he's able to do retrofits to them as
Yeah.
well. But a lot of the stuff is brand new. But the Romans pioneered a technique which was to use brick and then apply veneers and all sorts of different color marbles and patterns to build buildings very fast. They could then use concrete to make domes and groin vaults and all sorts of impressive structures like that. And what it means is that by the time Pliny the Elder is writing, it's very clear that Rome is a world-class city in a way that it hadn't been. I think they're the Portico of Livia is something that was admired at the time. If you read Strabo, who wrote a book geography at exactly the time that Augustus lived, and he lived for a time in Rome, and he writes the sort of somewhat in awe of what's said. And let me see if I'm trying to find an extract here, which I thought sort of summed it up, where he says. Strabo wrote of the city he saw around 20 BC. If on passing the old forum, you saw one forum after another ranged along the old one, and basilicas and temples, and saw also the Capitolium, that's the temple of Jupiter on the Capitol Hill, and the works of art there, and those of the Palatium, that's the palace in which Augustus lived, and Livius Porticus, you would easily become oblivious to everything else outside. Such is Rome. There's this sense that it's transformed. It's a golden city on a hill, if you could use an
Yeah.
expression.
And as well, it's and next thing I want to talk about because it's so we touched a little bit on this in the last episode, but I want to talk about this in more detail in this one is, the Augustus was very much a family man as well, and he has a few adoptive sons as well. And we have talked about some of them, of course, most famously Tiberius, who wasn't that much younger than Augustus at the time. So, but yeah, we had a lot of he had his wife Livia and obviously his daughter Julia, who I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about as well. So I want to talk a little bit about because he was a family man. He was a family guy, I guess you can say. But it's so let's talk about what his family values were and how, you know, his daughter would be kind of the black sheep of the family in a way. So I want to talk as well about where his family values stood at the time of an emperor. He was kind of a little player, as I would say, as a young man, but of course, as he grew older and became imperator and Augustus, he became more conservative in the family values as well.
So it's one of the very interesting and intriguing elements in trying to understand Augustus as a man, because so much of what we know about him, and we talked about this in the first episode, was the narrative is somewhat edited, right? That there we don't have a lot of gossipy. How can I say that let's start cut that bit and let's start again. Trying to gather my thoughts here.
They're very bad.
Okay. Trying to understand Augustus as a man is a thorny problem because partly what we know about him is really filtered. I mean, a lot of the things we know about him has been shaped by historians like Tacitus, for example,
Yeah.
biographers like Suetonius, who took a particular view of him. For Tacitus, he was a sort of necessary evil because civil war had happened before, and they didn't want civil war again. So he was the best you could expect. The problem is the people who came after him weren't as good, and it got worse from that point on.
Mm.
Suetonius looks at him as being, and his book in the 12 Caesars is the biggest one with Augustus. Is this man is multifaceted, but impenetrable to some degree. Yes, he has this past where I don't know, he's a thug, frankly. I mean, he goes around killing people. You've got to remember, we didn't talk about it last week,
Yeah.
but the point is that there's a point where they introduce things called prescriptions. And these are not to go and get drugs. These are when, for example, they eliminate their enemies and his friends work out who they're going to eliminate. And if they don't
He's
like
kind of a
people, they
mafia boss in a way.
yes, and it was very interesting. I'm trying to remember. I Claudius, the BBC series,
Mm.
Augustus was played brilliantly by Brian Blessed, and my understanding is from
We
things I've
really
seen
need a
on.
reboot of that series, by the way. BBC, come on.
Well, I don't know. I think they have made the series, and the cast was absolutely fabulous. Brian Blessed, Sian Phillips, George Baker. It's just an amazing cast. I mean, and I'll just say as a footnote, when I'm a biographer writing about these people, I have to try really hard to completely forget those people playing those roles. It was so easy for me to let George Baker become the man he played as Tiberius, and then me write about that man. My Tiberius is not that man, and I had to work very hard in my imagination, in my head, to stop him creeping in because he was an interpretation. And the interpretation that Brian Blessed struggled with is how do I play this man? And the screenplay writer, the director, basically said he's a mafia boss. And at
Yeah.
that point, Brian Blessed knew how to play him, right? So he has this. We know he had a temper because I think Marcinus and sometimes Agrippa had to sort of say, "Oh, calm yourself," because he just explode.
It's
So he was a
interesting
man
because
of great.
every time you kind of picture Justice as a calm and articulate man, respectable man. You wouldn't think of him as a guy having a temper in a way.
No, you probably wouldn't. But I mean, I think this is the temptation is that we tend to forget these are people.
Yeah.
And part of the interesting thing as a biographer, and this is what I try to do, is you look at the cold marble statue, and you've got to remember, first of all, the Romans would paint their statues to make them look lifelike. But even then, they're sort of perfect versions of what those people look like. So clearly, the Augustus that we see as this very handsome-looking face and this full head of hair and these, he just looks youthful. He never got old in the statues. This is what's amazing. He's always the same age. So
Yeah.
someone made, and I'm going to get a guess, it was Augustus himself that picked on one and said, I like that one. And nobody bothered to make him look older as he got older.
Mm. I
So,
mean, to be
we know
fair, no
he's,
one ever did that with any other emperor as well. So he
well,
wasn't he was the
but
first
nobody,
of many.
yeah, but nobody ruled as long as him
Yeah.
either. He ruled for 40 something years, right? I mean, there were some emperors who didn't last months, right? So,
Yeah.
Tiberius lasted 22 years and Augustus ruled for at least twice that long. So, uh, what you end up with is this idea that
And
these are.
Tiberius was quite old already at the time that he took the
He
throne.
was 55. Yeah, he was in his 50s. So a mature man. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's very easy to look at these statues
Yeah.
and think you're looking at an accurate representation of these people. Well, the chance are it's not. It's a somewhat manufactured image, and Mary Beard has put on some excellent lectures, and you can find them on YouTube and elsewhere, where she explains the idea of one emperor succeeding the other, try to sort of make himself look a little bit like the predecessor, because by doing that, it continues this notion of a sort of an imperial family and a dynasty and so on. So, the way that the hair is cut under the Julio-Claudians, the sort of the gaze they have, the way that they stand, and so forth. I mean, it's these are deliberate choices by the sculptor, probably guided by someone who's given them instructions. But they are people. They are people. And when people say to me, for example, and they write about when I write about Agrippa, and they say, "Well, you didn't tell me about what he looked like or his hair color." We don't know. We actually don't know. We have images on coins, and they seem
Mm.
to consistently show a certain facial look. We have no idea what his hair color was. We don't know his eyes. We don't really know what he sounded like.
Interesting
So
because
really,
Caesar, for example, is immediately recognizable as a character, and as I remember Mary Bird again. You mentioned her. She talked about someone finding a statue of Caesar while they're fishing, and they were like, "Oh my God, it's Caesar!" So it's interesting. Some people, so some
but
Roman characters are way more recognizable than others.
well, okay. I'm gonna recommend you go watch the Julius Caesar episode that Mary Beard
Mm.
did and a couple of the lectures because she makes a very astute observation. Dame Professor Mary Beard, who I greatly admire. So she makes the point that the only ones that we can be sure of is that there are some coins which have a side profile of a man to which the name Julius Caesar is associated. So we must assume, and it fits quite closely the description in Suetonius. But all of these other statue busts, which people label as Julius Caesar, you can't be sure of that because they don't have the name Julius Caesar attached to them. The only what you keep going back to the coin and say, does this look like? So when the men found in the river, was it Saône or the Rhône in Lyon, I think it was, and they pulled out this and they go, c'est Jules Caesar.
Yeah. That's the one that's referring to. Yeah.
Well, well, she has a discussion about that, and the point is, she goes and looks at it. And I know in another episode, I think Adrian Goldsworthy goes there and looks at it, and he makes the clear point that is Julius Caesar. You always have to look at these statues with the critical idea
Mm.
that first of all, it may not be an accurate representation
Yeah.
of the person. And I know that Roman sculptors could make accurate representations because we've got some extraordinarily, wrinkled faces and so forth, big ears and whatnot. But when you get to the imperial family, it's not quite the same because there is an element, and I use the word carefully, manipulation of the image. We would call it propaganda. I don't know that they thought of it in those sorts of, but they craft an image in the same way that when you look at images of Alexander the Great on the coins and the statues, you have this beautiful young man with the flowing hair, and then of course on the coins with horns, ram's horns, and all sorts of things going on. It's a managed image. So, the point is when we look at images of Augustus on the coins, on statues, he may have looked like that when he was 22 or something, but he didn't look
Mm.
like that when he was 77
Yeah.
or
Oh no, he
6. Right? So,
didn't.
so we don't know what he looked like. All we know is from, for example, Suetonius, as he got older, his eyesight started failing and his voice got weaker. And in fact, his stepsons and his grandsons had to speak for him. They had to read out these things and they would actually, be stand-ins for him. And you can imagine he's not very well at this point. He always had some ailments. And we talked about, I think, in the last case where at Philippi, he was physically sick. It was also true at, I think, Actium, where he fell ill and he wasn't able to participate in that battle. He was an observer pretty much. So there are some conditions. He has, aches and pains, and he has, I don't know, but all sorts of maybe asthma or something like this. He goes down with,
Mm.
I think it's typhus at different times in his life. He almost comes to death at different times. Amazingly, he survives this all. So you've got a man who's got a lot of life experiences here that shape his character. So as a young man, he is raised in a Rome where it's a dangerous city. He then becomes part of making it the dangerous city as one of the
Mm.
three triumvirs with Antonius and Lepidus, and he's hunting down enemies and he's really stamping his identity on the city. So making people afraid, I think, is part of his character. Does that mellow over time? Quite possibly. I should imagine. But the way he interacts with people, it's very interesting. You see again in accounts like Suetonius. that he is about all the time. He goes to theaters and to performances of horse exercises and things which his grandsons are involved in, and he's traveling all the time. But he doesn't like to arrive in daytime. He always arrives at nighttime because he doesn't like fuss, right? So he doesn't expect when he goes to a city parades and showers of petals of flowers. No, no, he comes in darkness. He has good night's sleep, and he follows the formal agenda for the next day, does the religious
He
ceremonies and
was
so
a
on and so
night
forth.
man,
Well, I think he's
fighter
a
of the
man.
day man.
Well, my read of him is that he didn't like fuss and bother. He played the game,
Mm,
which was we have our place in society. Everybody must observe where they stand, and he's pretty much the top of the pile, right?
yeah.
But he respects the patricians and the equestrians and the plebeians and and all the others. He refers to soldiers as milites, for example, whereas I think Julius Caesar preferred comilitiones, which basically means comrades or fellow soldiers. He absolutely did not like to be called, for example, Dominus, Lord.
Mm,
Um, he referred to himself as Caesar, so that sort of became a title that he was comfortable with. So I think what you've got is a man that, as he matures, grows into this role. And by the way, nobody's had that role in Roman society before. He's not a king. He is very careful not to be a king because the allegations that Julius Caesar were that he wanted to be one, and you saw how that ended. He was assassinated. And
yeah.
what's fascinating about Augustus is that he was able to do everything that Julius Caesar wanted, and he died a natural death.
Mm,
So he was the Caesar that Julius Caesar never became. It's very interesting, and he
yeah.
he did it in really clever, subtle ways by delegating authority to people who got the job done on the battlefield or in the political scenario and so on. So he accumulate titles and victories and honors and public goodwill without always having to be the man doing the actual dirty work of those tasks. And in terms of traditional values, he seems to have steered the public into following, the role of the family. He was very much aware, it seems, that young men were not getting married and having children. And he said, right, we've got to change this. So the Romans are at risk of sort of, becoming extinct because we're not having enough babies. So he institutes policies and tax incentives and so on to actually try and get fathers to have children, and gets
Mm.
very annoyed by people who refuse to have
Which
one.
is interesting because that's kind of what the authoritarian playbook in the 20th and the 21st century as well. That I'm sorry, I just
Oh,
had to
yeah.
do this analogy because we see this in the Third Reich and we see this in Russia and we see this in the United States as well when J.D. Vance speak, that they want, because children are obviously in easier to indoctrinate, and that's why they want more babies, but also for the Roman army, for example, in the Augustus time, I assume, that it can be easier led into the soldier life. I can imagine, and also easier to indoctrinate as young
Well,
children, and that's with authoritarian and fascist regimes today. You see, as well, that they want more kids because kids, like I said, are easier to indoctrinate as well.
Well, so I don't know. I mean, when I can't speak to that. That's contemporary affairs. But in a sort of an ancient Roman context, I'll throw these things out there. So first of all, you've got a very class structured society. Like I said, there's patricians who are by and large old families, which go back right to the 6th century BC and earlier with the regal period and senators and so on. They basically have all the priesthoods and a lot of the magistracies and so on. And then there are the plebeians who are the common people, if you will, and I think they're numerically larger. But they also have a lot of wealthy families in there too by the time of
Yeah,
Augustus, by the way. So you can have very poor patricians, very rich plebeians, and then there's this group sort of who are patricians who are not really getting into politics, who are in finance and banking and so on. They're called equestrians because at the time of war making, their membership were given horses and they provided the cavalry. It's an old idea. So where you have Augustus fitting in all of this, I think, is there's a wider context. There's an enormous slave population. And
yeah,
what's fascinating about the way the Romans organized their class society is there was some social mobility allowed, right? So what defined your position in society was how much wealth you had. And if you didn't have enough wealth, you became one of those people. And if you came, a certain amount, then you could become one of the other people. And occasionally Augustus helps poor patricians so they can stay within the Senate, because they run out of money effectively. They become poor, but he needs them, so he'll actually provide the cash to do that. And Tiberius does something of the same, by the way. The other aspect of it is that the way that Romans treat slavery is it also has an incentive that a slave
It's,
can
it's not
buy.
like the slavery of 18th and 19th century United States, for example. It was brutal and it should be unforgivable, of course, but it wasn't. You can't compare 19th and 18th century United States slavery with Roman slavery.
Well, there were certainly elements of Roman slavery that had that too. I mean, there were the great
Yeah,
latifundia, the great big
yeah, yeah,
farming
yeah. Of
estate.
course.
No, but for a certain number of slaves, there was the possibility of working as part of a familia of a house, that the family of a house, that they would maybe be given allowance and they could then save up and then they could go to them and say, I would like to buy my freedom. And at that point, then they would be manumitted, which is there was a formal ceremony where it was recorded that this man was my slave and now is, and he would be given his first name and then he would adopt the name of the master. And that person and his children then became citizens. They could actually become fully participating members in the Roman polity. And what's absolutely fascinating is it over time it transformed Roman society. A lot of, I think, the engine of entrepreneurial development and so the wealth building and so forth was the activity of these people who'd been former slaves, the freed people who then went on to become participants in Roman society. And you see them all over the empire doing this, in Herculaneum and Pompeii and Britain and all over. And it's something that again Augustus was very aware of. So I think somebody came to him and said, "Would you consider making, I can't remember what it was, Gaul, Roman citizens?" And he makes a point to say no, because Roman citizenship has tremendous value. We can't just hand it out like it's not worth anything. And what's very interesting is Claudius, his grandson, who became emperor in the 40s, 50s AD, he took a different view. He was born in Gaul. He was born in Lugdunum, 10 BC, 1st of August, I think it was. And one of the things he did was to actually give freedom, give citizenship to Gauls, because he said these are fully participating Romans if ever there were anybody. And in fact, that was just how things had evolved in Roman thinking. And then right under Caracalla, of course, you get the Constitutio Antonini, where they actually give citizenship to all free people. So, at that point, it is very much what Augustus feared. Everybody gets a free ticket, as it were. But
Mm.
under Augustus, there is a recognition that it is something very special, and it's not given away freely. The fact that Romans are expected to behave in a certain way in public, they're expected to abide by older norms and standards, so virtus and
It is
industria.
a very conservative family. It's a conservative society, so not family, but society in a way.
Well, I think that's deliberate. I mean, the Romans have a phrase for it. It's called mos maiorum. It's the
Mm.
tradition of the elders. And they always look back in a way that we don't. They look back the good old days as if to say they
Mm.
only get worse from here. And it's always a struggle to get today to be like it was. I think that's the Roman mentality. Whereas, and I live in American society, which is very much looking forward, well, at least it has been, and which is about material and educational betterment. I mean, you want your kids to do better than you did as a
Yeah.
parent. And the Romans sort of look for stability. They look for a sort of straight line connecting all the time periods. And we would find that, I think, a little bit strange. It tends to hold back rather than to propel you forward. And that probably accounts for some of the stability of Roman society. It also, I think, points to some of their resistance to things like technological change. Yes, there was technology change, but I mean, people often wonder, why is it the hero of Alexandria had the steam engine, but we never sort of see any evolution of that into like a railway
Yeah.
train or something? Or why is it that I think someone went to It's either Tiberius or Vespasian, I forget who, and says I've got this indestructible glass, and this man is sent away. Basically, don't tell anybody about this thing because you'll kill the glass industry,
Mm.
sort of thing. So Augustus is in that mind frame. Okay, and I think really underpinning all of this is the idea that he had grown up where there was civil war. He had seen his adoptive father murdered. He'd had to kill a lot of people to where he was, and it was just, wouldn't it be possible just to have a time when we don't do this anymore? And I think when we talk about the Pax Romana, which more correctly is the Pax Augusta, that's what you see. That's why it's called the Arapacis Augusta, for example. It celebrates the Augustan peace. It is the idea that in his eyes, we have quelled the rebellions around the world. There is no war anymore, and out of this we have a world at peace. Well, of course, it's a lie because there's always wars going on and rebellions and the armies mutinying and all sorts of things, which is what I explain in my book Augustus at War. But for the people in Italy and the people in Rome, that was very distant, right? Very, very far away. Now, Rome hadn't always been like that. You only have to look at the Gracchi brothers, for example, and even in the time of Cicero, where there was mob violence in the city. As far as I recall, there was no mob violence in that sort of way under Augustus. There were riots, and they were caused by a whole different set of things. And by pulling the levers, for example, of famously what Juvenal said, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, by providing free entertainments and food and lots of distractions.
Mm.
And oh, by the way, like you said, turning Rome from a city of brick into one of marble,
Yeah.
lots of fun things to do every day. That you can have a fulfilling life and you can actually feel comfortable and at ease. Hey, why don't you spend the day at Agrippa's bathhouse? It's a wonderful new facility,
Mm.
type of thing. And that was new. Before I think
What
it's
about
just if
gladiatorial games and etc.? Like entertainment. We talked about
he
bread
didn't
and
actually like
circus.
them that
You
much.
mentioned it. You mentioned it, bread and circus, but and gladiatorial games was being part of Rome. Obviously they didn't have the Colosseum yet, but was there a lot of
Yeah.
gladiatorial? What kind of circuses did you expect under the time of Augustus?
So the big structure was the Circus Maximus, the Circus Maximus, which was actually directly below the Palatine Hill,
Is
and
it the kind of like where Colosseum is today? It burned down in the Great Fire of Rome, and then
so
rebuilt Colosseum on that.
so where the Colosseum is now was basically a swamp, pretty much,
Yeah.
right? The reason why the Nero built his house there, and they had a big lake, and then ultimately when that was demolished, and then they had to build the Colosseum with lots of plumbing works, lots of drains and hydraulics to keep that place drained. So Rome is you're talking about games and things. So there were gladiatorial contests and things within. There were two kinds, the Munera and the Ludi. And the Munera really were the ones which were celebrating the life of an individual, and it was paid for by the family, and that was something much back in time. The Ludi were sort of religious kind of games, and there were several of those, and Augustus would go to those because they had a religious sort of connotation and association. What he preferred contests, athletic games, and chariot races. And in fact, the Circus Maximus, which is where some of the gladiatorial games and the beast hunts took place, because it was a ready-made surface area for that, potentially housing 250,000 people. Then there was also the Circus Flaminius, which was a bit further into the Campus Martius, so that also was a facility.
I'm sorry, we had to take a little wee break there, but we are back. We were talking about gladiatorial games and circuses. So let's continue where we left off. And yeah, we were talking about how circus and gladiatorial games under Pontifex Maximus were happening. I'm sorry for the wee break, but we are back now.
So public entertainments are an important part of life and will become even more prominent in Rome in the centuries to come after Augustus. But in his own lifetime, Rome's first stone amphitheater was built by Statilius Taurus, who was another man like Agrippa, a very trusted deputy and a very successful general. Much less famous now than Agrippa, but someone certainly the two were often thought of as being sort of companions, as being reliable stalwarts. So for Rome's first stone amphitheater happens under Augustus. The other thing I was going to say is that for people who watch Gladiator 2, they will have
I'm
seen
sorry if
what
you
was
did,
called
by
the
the way.
So there was a Naumachia, right? There was a sea battle in an amphitheater. And the pretense in the story is that under Commodus, I think was it Caracalla, I forget which of the emperors, this is happening in the Colosseum. Well, at that time, it's very unlikely it would be the Colosseum because the underground, the Hypogeum had been built and you couldn't actually have those things anymore there. Possibly when it was built by Vespasian and Titus in its opening decade, you could have. There was a proper site built by Augustus for Naumachii, and it was, I think it was on the other side of the river Tiber. It was an immense lake with stadium seating around it, and this is what would happen. They would have these reenactments of the Battle of Actium or Salamis or something like that, you know. So Augustus was very aware that there was a need for this kind of public entertainment. They were phenomenally expensive, as you might imagine, but it was something that hadn't happened on that scale. When Julius Caesar had gladiatorial games as an aspiring politician, what he would do, he would take over the Roman Forum. They would build temporary seating. They'd build stage seating at different parts. They would hang huge drapes around everywhere to sort of create a sort of confined space. And then in the middle of the market, they would have the gladiators. And this is because there was no formal space. And it was under Augustus that the first formal spaces begin to take place. Now, Augustus was much more into theatre, much more into acrobatics, much more into athletic games, and these things called Trojan games, games of Troy, which were a bit like the dressage we see in Austria, where people show horsemanship and these sorts of things. It was a performance done by the youth organization in ancient Rome, and his two adopted sons, Caius and Lucius, were very much involved in that. They were the leaders of that particular thing, and it involved weapons and riding horses and doing all sorts of exercise of skill. And if you got them wrong and you fell off your horse, you could be badly injured. In fact, someone was made lame because they did have an accident on a horse. So this whole idea of the population being provided food and entertainment really gets its legs under Augustus.
Mm. Now, I thought a little, try to talk a little bit earlier, but I just now it's as good time as any bit because we have to talk about the family values and of Augustus and his family. And I mentioned earlier as well the infamous Julia as well, the daughter of Justice, like I said earlier, was the black sheep of the family, and of course his adoptive family as well. And we talked about this in the very first episode that you came on, which was almost I need to count now 4 years ago almost now, which was where we talked about Germanicus, who was originally intended to be the heir to Augustus because he didn't really have any sons with Livia. So let's talk about the family and family ties because obviously Germanicus and Tiberius is one of the most famous, you know, heirs, for the lack of better words, adoptive heirs at least for Augustus. So
Yes.
let's talk about how the family values, and of course, the ever controversial Julia played a role as the embarrassment of and the thorn in
Well,
the side for Augustus.
her story is immensely sad. And everybody sort of reads it, I think, realizes that there is a cruel hard side to Roman politics because it's a male-dominated sport, if I could call it that. And in the
It's a
first
rule for
episode,
me, but not for thee, as I say.
well, I mean, so it ties in, doesn't it? A bit like having the imperial family portrayed as the mafia, you could say, where the capo, effective, arranges
Yeah.
that members of his family can be married off to members of another family, either a rival to bring them in and neutralize the threat, or basically to, ensure that there's a line of succession and his genes, if you will, go through and actually perpetuate the family. And um, going back to the basic, so Julia was his only child effectively, and that was through a wife he divorced. I think it was Scribonia, wasn't it? He married Livia, who brought two sons of her own from another husband. From what we can tell, they never had children. Nobody quite understands why. But I have to believe they were absolutely in love. I think everything that they did, they saw in each other. I mean, he obviously saw a beautiful woman with a
Was she
great
too old
intellect.
to have children, perhaps, at the point of she met Augustus,
I don't
or
think so.
you
I
know,
think that
to compare to Napoleon, Josephine when she married Napoleon, she was too old to have children by that point. Should that be the case with Livia as well?
I think you probably need to go talk to somebody who's actually an expert in Livia
Mhm.
to know more about that. My understanding is I don't think we know the answers. And this is part of the problem of trying to understand the role of women, not just the imperial family women
Mm.
in Roman history, because they're very much bit players. The stories that we have
Or was
really
perhaps
puts men.
abortion a thing in that time? That they may not know about. That wasn't obviously a kind of taboo in this society at the time
Well,
that we
there were
may
all
not
sorts. I
know.
mean, you can read Pliny and you can read all sorts of other sources where there are also pots and potions and all sorts of things which could be
Yeah,
potentially toxic to the patient. But um, go back to the point about the sources. Roman women are largely invisible. You get a name here in a context, and it's usually some unusual thing that's going on. But the stories we know are dominated by men.
yeah.
And when you're
And
trying to write
if a woman is portrayed, the wicked witch of the West, in a way. That
well,
kind, for example, with Nero's mother, she's the witch of the Western, in I Claudius, Livia is, for example, portrayed to have poisoned everyone within the family. So, they're either
but
not
that's the thing.
mentioned or they're kind of the wicked witch of the West in a way.
Yeah. So again, this is part of the way that Roman historians characterize women in their storytelling. And for example, I think the idea of insinuations of Livia as being basically the poisoner in the family to get her
Yeah.
son, I think that appears within the context. There's a rumor going around, or people thought that, this sort of idea, it's not a fact, but people sort of talked about it, so no smoke without fire, type of idea. And then Robert Graves then made that the centerpiece, which was then worked up into the TV show. And of course, that was the central narrative
Mm.
pushing the story through. But I think the reality is harder than that. So Roman women had a different sort of relationship to their menfolk in the way that, for example, they could inherit, they did rule the home, they could have a sort of persona uh, when they were about town. They could not take part in politics. That was the big no-no. And the problem that Augustus and increasingly Tiberius, mainly Tiberius actually had with his mother Livia, is that she sort of tinkered around on the edges of politics and he didn't like it. And I think under Augustus, she knew not to do that because it was always going to be about Augustus. What Julia seems to have got wrong, at least this is the way it's portrayed, I think, in the
And
sources, the
I think we
Antonius.
mentioned this earlier as well, is that Augustus was very much a family man. He, wanted a conservative family, with family values that, loyalty, etc., loyalty to your partner. And Julia, I don't know, remember if she was married to Tiberius at this time, but, to use a modern term, she kind of hoarded around from what the sources tell. So, but was she as livid and for lack of better term, loose. And I don't want to downplay Julia, as a person, rebelling. She was kind of the punk rocker in the family, from my understanding, rebelling against the conservative father as a daughter who, you know, daughter of the highest council in the known world at the time. And,
Yeah.
she
So
didn't, she
let's
kind of
let's go
was a
back.
rebellious punk rock girl in a way.
Yeah. I'm going to say I don't subscribe to that. I don't think that's
I
true.
know. I'm just
Um,
saying from what most people think about her as, and
yeah.
what she
I think
comes out like.
let's sort of put some factual things in there. So she was the wife of Claudius Marcellus. So
Yeah.
that would be the son of Octavia, Augustus's beloved sister. So he was Augustus' nephew. He seems to have died in his late teens, probably from typhus or something like that. She then gets married to Agrippa. with whom she has, I think, three, maybe more children, probably four
That they
children.
seem to be quite have quite a decent relationship, right? Agrippa and Julia.
Yes. Yeah, so the relationship that Agrippa had with her obviously was sexually active. They had children. That there's a story, I forget what the author was, where Agrippa is out in Asia Minor, Anatolia area, and Julia's with her. He goes and does some public business, and she's kind of chaperoned by some other people. And something pretty awful happens, like, I don't know, she gets abandoned in the situation, she's at risk. Agrippa finds out about this and is furious. His wife has been put in danger, and I'm going to hold people to account
Yeah,
for that. So he felt, I mean, clearly, I mean, he felt something towards his younger wife, but also because she's the daughter of his best friend, right? So there's a kind of double thing going on there. And then when Agrippa dies in 12, I think in 11 or 10, then Tiberius is married to her. And that's where things they start off, it seems to be quite good-ish. But the problem that is for Tiberius that he had to divorce the woman he really loved, which
yeah.
was Vipsania Agrippina, who was actually another daughter of Agrippa. So it's, it's kind of levels of interrelationship of families here. It's sometimes hard to get a hold of all the names.
Hmm.
But Tiberius marries a woman that he didn't particularly want to. He seems to try to make a marriage. They have a go at having a baby. The baby, I think, is stillborn, after which he loses interest in her. And that seems to be a point in time where she feels she's been forced to marry three times. Nobody cares about what she wants, most of all her father. There is an idea that she became a sort of focal point of opposition to her father, right? So there's not
Yeah,
really official opposition, politically speaking, to Augustus. He does what he does. The Senate pretty much goes along with it. There are some individual senators who have issues with him and feel strong enough, that they call Perni Pisones, for example, and some of the older families still harbored grudges. The Domiti and people like this. But the point is that there wasn't really anybody who had a rival point of view that could sort of say Augustus is bad. We need to go back to the old republic. There wasn't a Cicero, if you like. So maybe she became a sort of person who some disillusionment, maybe, who said, I think we need to sort this out. And there is an insinuation, by the way, that the stepson Nero Claudius Drusus, the man we know as Drusus the Elder that I wrote my first book about, may be also in that same camp. That there's supposedly a letter that he wrote to his brother Tiberius where he says that we really need to ask stepfather to step down and let the Republic function as it's supposed to. And that's brilliantly portrayed in the I, Claudius TV series, where, Tiberius is reading this letter to Livia and to Augustus, and he sort of starts to fudge the words, and Augustus begins to realize, you're not reading the letter properly, read the letter. And, it's the stress of war. He's not thinking straight. He needs a holiday. So there was clearly at some point some level of discontent among some people, and ironically, it may have been members of his own family. So if you think of Julia in those kinds of terms, the sexual aspect, I don't know whether it was actual sexual, but it just may have been she met lots of men
hmm.
who were people who had opposing opinions finally that could go to somebody and express those opinions too. And I don't know. I think it's something that's very unclear in the sources. What we do have is supposedly she is having sexual relations in the Roman Forum, and everybody seems to be, doing things to her in public. And then finally, the last person to find out is Augustus,
Hmm.
famously, "Is there no one in Rome who has not slept with my daughter?" Which is what Brian
Yeah.
Blessed beautifully did in I, Claudius. And he then punishes her through banishment. He can't
And there was even what kind of funny is as well that Tiberius doesn't really care in bringing her back when he becomes emperor again. She's kind of stuck
well,
there.
but there's a preface to that, right? He is the husband, and he's an estranged husband. But what he does was he understands he has a husband's obligation, and he writes to Augustus and says, "Look, father, father-in-law, could could you please be careful how you look after her? She's
Yeah,
obviously in a bad spot now, and I would like to." And basically, Augustus says, "These are your divorce papers. take back, what you want, and she's a divorcee now, and and he basically responds, I tried, and if she can keep the things I gave her, type of thing. And I dare say Tiberius is quite pleased to get rid of her. He's happy being in the army doing army things,
Hmm.
it seems to be. And then when he in fact himself takes an early retirement to Rhodes, I mean he keeps a very arm's length, but also intercedes. So um, it is a fundamental breakdown in in Augustus's worldview. He had hoped that this woman is going to live the life of the Roman matron and is going to, bring him family members and so on. And in fact, what she's brought into the world, if you remember, she brings into the world Caius and Lucius, who are the adopted sons of Caesar, and also the young man who's born posthumously, who we call, was called Marcus Agrippa, but we know him as Agrippa Posthumus. So there are at least three children that she brings into the world. The one that she brings into the world with Tiberius is stillborn, so there's no issue there. But as far as what she was expected to do, she did her job, right? The problem is that Caius and Lucius die, right? They're on military assignments or maneuvers and they die prematurely. They're in their late 20s when they die. So the natural successors to Augustus end there. It then turns out that Agrippa Posthumus isn't as refined and socially aware and politically astute, and seems to basically throw tantrums and expects to get his
Yeah.
legacy from the family, and they won't give it to him. And in the end, he is basically ostracized from the family. He's written out the will and everything, and he's sent into exile himself. So it turns out that the family of Augustus, and it seems to be you sometimes find this with powerful, rich families. What do you do with the kids? I mean, the kids have no role until the parents are dead, right? And so in the case of Julia, the story is that she was bored, she became sexually promiscuous, and Augustus finds out about this, and he's humiliated and he banishes her. I think there's a case to be made, which I articulated, which is that maybe she became a sort of focus of a political opposition, and in order to banish her from that, to stop her doing it, that had to be dressed up in a sort of like a sexual mores story, because Augustus was going hard on family values,
Yeah.
and men must have children, and that means they pay taxes and they participate in Roman society and people for the army and all those sorts of things. But hers is a very difficult story because she is basically not in Augustus's will. She doesn't get anything. I mean, she's sent off to, isn't it, Pandatoria? And she lives in a fairly sort of basic lifestyle with, I think her mother goes into exile with her and a little retinue. You can still go visit that building. It's been excavated. You can visit, and it's a small island, and there's some sort of like a provision for a cistern for water and so on. But it was basic living. It wasn't anything fancy. And then finally, she's allowed to move to Rhegium, back on the mainland. As long as she doesn't interfere in things. When Augustus dies, Tiberius reads the will, and it's very clear that the will makes no provision for her, and he takes away her final allowance. So she dies pretty much, I'm going to guess, not destitute, but probably not much far away from that. And I think that we know that there are gravestones of some of the freedmen that worked in her household, which have been found in the area of Rhegium. So, she at that point fades out of history because, she was a disgraced daughter, whatever the source of that disgrace was.
We have to mention perhaps one of the biggest humiliations of, and it would be a criminal if he didn't mention. And we talked a lot about this, of course, in our episode on Tiberius and Germanicus as well. That and I know you now what I'm talking about is of course the Teutoburg first, because Rome was still expanding at this time, and of course Germany was one of the territories that they were aiming towards to go. And of course, one of the biggest, events in Roman history that was most historians are new to is kind of the Battle of Tours in a way for the Romans. Is the Battle of Teutoburg first, and of course Germanicus was horribly portrayed in this barbarian TV series, but Okay, let's talk about the events of the Teutoburg Forest and how, this would be where Augustus famous to say, Varus, bring me back my legions. So let's talk
Yeah.
about the events, the biggest perhaps humiliation in Augustus' life.
Well, so I'm going to start kind of with this comment really, which was from Suetonius,
Yeah,
and I just finished a paper that will appear in Ancient Warfare about the way that Augustus spun the failures in Germania to his advantage, which is, I think, something that people tend to overlook. So in 1617 BC, a raiding party of three Germanic tribes cross into what is Gaul, probably Gallia Belgica, and they crash into, by chance, I think it's the Fifth Legion Alaudi, being led by Marcus Lollius, who's the governor, and they manage to steal the eagle, the legionary eagle, which is humiliating. And the reason why that's humiliating is just a few years before, Augustus had seen and negotiated through Tiberius, probably, the return of the eagles and the standards from
yeah,
Parthia, which were the ones lost by, we talked about this last episode, that Marcus Antonius had lost when he was out there fighting the Parthians, and then before that, Carrhae. So, he thinks, I've been able to restore the balance and I've expunged the stain, and here we are all these years later, on his watch, somebody does the same thing. And it's a bad look. So he sets upon a program to conquer Germany, Germania. And Germany, you have to understand, in the Roman imagination, is everything basically from the Wadden Sea, which is basically the part of the Netherlands coastline out to the North Sea, across the Rhine and the Danube as far as the Vistula. That
it's
whole
not the
area.
German. It's not the Germany we think about today. That we
No,
think about.
it's
What is
what
it
we would
about?
now call, it was basically parts of Benelux. It'd be Netherlands, Germany, probably southern Denmark, Jutland. It would be Poland. It would be parts of, the parts of Austria and
Mm.
Switzerland along that line. It would be is it Slovakia and Slovenia? It's a sweep of country. And Hungary even as well, and parts of Romania. So it's a vast landscape, which they didn't really understand geographically, but they thought it was conquerable. That their first target was to eliminate and neuter the three tribes that caused them the humiliation. So it was the Sugambri, the Tencteri, and the Usipites, who lived on the left bank of the River Rhine. So over a 4-year period, Drusus the elder, Nero Claudius Drusus, the younger brother of Tiberius, the stepson of Augustus, goes on a war and is largely successful. He sort of manages to sweep the Roman army progressively from the west coast inwards as far as the Elbe. And some of the German tribes, the Cherusci and the Chauci, the Frisi and the Batavi, they all become amici. They become friends of the Roman people. Some of them treaty allies, and they will be honor bound, and there will be exchanges of hostages in some cases. And for example, Arminius of the
Yeah.
Cherusci is actually brought to Rome and raised, and it would seem to be becomes quite Romanized in his young lifetime. There is the fall and the death of Nero Claudius Drusus in 9. His brother then takes over the campaign and is somewhat successful in continuing the campaign. And in the Roman way of thinking, Germania is becoming less barbarica and more Roman. And over the years, the succession of Roman governors takes over, and what they do is try to pacify. And remember when I said that when Augustus was given his province, it was those parts of the world that still needed to be pacified. Well, Germania is one of those classic cases of a land that needs to be pacified. And as they move in and they start building towns, like Waldgirmus in the Lahn Valley, for example, you've got a marketplace there with a forum building and a basilica, and you've got shops and things. So German merchants and Roman merchants are coming together and they're trading goods. And we know the Romans are building roads and they're, adjudicating law and so forth. And finally, after about 3 or 4 successive governors, we get to Quintilius Varus, who is a friend of Tiberius, who was one of the proteges of Augustus years before. One of the up and coming guys who's had some success in Judea, has actually been in Africa and the rest of the places, and there's every reason to believe that the guy is a competent governor.
Mm.
Well, it turns out that he is given warnings of discontent and a potential uprising by people close to him, who are themselves German. And one of them, in fact, I think is the father-in-law of Arminius. We just mentioned him as one of the hostages handed over. The story seems to be that Arminius served in the Roman army as some kind of tribal auxiliary leader, possibly saw service in Illyricum when there was a 4-year revolt there, and didn't like what he was seeing. That's kind of one of the theories. And then makes it back to Germania and decides, I don't want to see in my country what's happened in Illyricum. What we need to do is kick these guys out. Interesting
Mm.
enough,
It's funny because in the series Barbarians, and again, I enjoyed season one to one extent, but season two was terrible. But he seemed to be the father-in-law of Arminius in the series seemed to be kind of portrayed as a sympathetic betrayer of the German people. And he seemed to be, if I remember correctly, he seemed to be kind of in favor of the Romans in the series. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not very well historically, and it's a mediocre series at best. But it seemed to be just interesting how he's so differently from what you portray him as in the series.
well, it's interesting because again, we have sources, and the sources are generally speaking. I mean, there's one that's close to the event contemporaneously, which is Velleius Paterculus, right? So to him, it's contemporary history. But all the other ones tend to be separated by 50, 60, 100, 200 years. And the problem is some of those are relying on earlier accounts and, there may be some documents and there's some now hearsay and so on. But what seems to have happened by and large is the consensus of, I think, is the way, is that the Cherusci were considered allies of the Romans and were trusted. I mean, the fact is that they could do quite well out of becoming Romans. Certainly, the upper echelon of a tribal community like them, that the war leader would be, given respect and that could actually command his own unit in the Roman army. We know, and you must have seen this yourself, there were Norwegian mercenaries working for the
Yeah.
Roman army in the second or third century, which is amazing, isn't it? So there were people who knew there was money to be made, spoils to be
I mean, we
had,
have
and
archaeological in one book in it's I think it's in English now as well. The Danish Empire. We see that there is archaeological evidence that Danes as well as Norwegians, you know, you have coins dating from ancient Rome that were, and they did indeed work with Romans in that time period. It's really
yeah,
astonishing to think about.
so this is great timing for me because I'm writing a book right now for Pen and Sword, which
Mm.
is Roman Chronicles Germania, and I'm able to build in some of the really, really most recent insights. The world that we think of Barbaricum or Germania Libera, if you will, Germania Magna, as being primitive and backward and not connected to anybody and constantly fighting, is not borne out by the archaeology. There's a lot of trading between different tribes and the Romans on the other side of the Rhine and the Danube. There are merchants going in constantly. There are expeditions. The Romans are sailing ships up the coast because they want amber. The Marcomanni seem to carve out a market space there where the in-betweeners, they make money because they can trade with the people up in Jutland to get the amber, and they can trade it down on the across the river. And they've got Roman merchants living in the Marcomannic capital because they're brokering the deals. I mean, it's really different. And of course, as you move through Roman history, there are more and more Germans actually working in the Roman army, and in fact, the Roman army in Northern Europe, in the Rhineland Danube, becomes effectively a Germanized army. It's quite extraordinary, this transformation that and the migrations are one element of that, and it's fascinating that our views are changing because the facts are coming out of the soil and they're challenging our accepted views. Romans were big then for things, the famous hobby trophies and cups, for example, that are found in Lolland, isn't it, in Denmark? So
Yeah.
someone had received a cup from Caius Silius, a silver cup, which is beautiful. It's in the collections of the Archaeological Museum, in the National Museum in Copenhagen, I think it is. So, you've got to look at it as Germany at this time is a really vibrant, very diverse. These people, some of them are Celtic, some of them are what we would think of as being Germanic or Teutonic. And the span goes all the way up to the Baltic lands, like we just sort of, whoever imagined Norwegians would be connected with the Roman Empire. But there we are.
Bum, bum. There we go.
So the Germany, the Germania that Marcus Lollius is marching his troops through, it is much more diverse. I mean, in 9 AD, what he's doing effectively is taking his detachments of the legions, the three legions that he has, from their summer operations, and some of them are going to go back to their Rhine camps. But you've got to remember that the Rhine frontier at this place has already moved well inland. We tend to think about that's being the Roman frontier. At this point, the Roman frontier is all the way further in. There are camps all over the place that we know from the Roman sources that there are watchtowers and there are road watch stations and there are courts happening. So I would imagine that the Roman legions are probably operating as centuries or cohorts now, and they're deployed across different places. And what's happening is that Lollius, who had actually failed, in 1716 through ineptitude, to some degree is being repeated by Varus in 9 because he's taking things for granted in a different way. He's been there for 2 or 3 years. His predecessors seem to have kind of dealt with problems, and his mission is to basically turn this place into a part of the Roman Empire, tax it, make the natives Roman, make them speak Latin, do the stuff, and let's see some togas around the place. But the Germans under the Cherusci and their allies, the Angrivarii and some of the other people, Bructeri and so on, aren't really totally sold on the idea. What was surprising to me when I was doing my research for my books was there were lots of revolts. It was like a whack-a-mole. So the Romans would go in and they would think that they've captured it, and then they sign some treaties, and then what? The next year there's a revolt. The fact that Romans have got German hostages, we got plenty of Germans. We don't worry about those. And then they'll revolt. They send another army in. They deal with that. Then they say, "Okay, we're better. Are we good now? We're all qual." And then what we find is the next year they revolt. So it just seems to be that the Germanic cultures, the Celtic cultures in Germania, were like a lot of the cultures. It was the same in Illyricum. It took the Romans years in Illyricum to pacify it. It took them 200 years in Spain to
Yeah,
pacify the Iberian Peninsula, and almost as long in Britain. You could argue they never pacified Britannia because they were still trying to fight
yeah.
in Scotland right till
I
the
mean,
end. So,
Boudica revolt entered the chat, for example.
yeah. So what Varus does is frankly not pay as much attention as he probably should have, and he finds himself ambushed by a very well organized, and I'm going to say by Arminius, who is schooled in
Yeah,
Roman doctrine and combat theory. He knows how they're going to respond. He picks them when they're on the march. They're presumably not on metalled roads anymore. They're trying to cut pathways through the forests and they know the country and they just are able to pick them off. So over not one day, but several days, probably 4 or 5, if the sources are correct, we know that gradually what's happening is the columns, which are spread out over several miles by now, they're intermingled with women and carriages and merchants and slave trade. All sorts of people are mingled in. In other words, it's not a tightly organized military on the march in the way it's supposed to be. He is treating it, it would seem, well, we're just going through friendly country. Why do we need to worry about the normal standards of discipline?
yeah.
Because, there's nobody here going to hurt us. Well, of course, he got that wrong. Grievously, he'd been told it was going to happen and he ignored it.
It's interesting. I'm trying to do. I know this is kind of based on long shot, but it's kind of to compare with Gaul, for example, where they are very much united in the fight against Caesar, and they still fail. Whereas in Germany, they succeed. I mean, that just is kind of terrain differences as well. That is in factor here, but because the Germans of, sorry, the Romans fight mostly on open fields. That's what they're good at. But it's also, in Gaul, they are kind of seem to be united, and the versus generatives, I think they had, but and they fail when they fight against Caesar. But in Gaul, sorry, in Germany, they kind of succeed this rebellion against the Romans. So it's interesting to do a comparison to see what is difference between the Battle of Gaul and the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. So it's interesting to see, it's kind of similar in a way, I think, these two battles.
Well, so this so ironically, you're getting to the final chapter of my book, which I sort of sketched out in Roman Conquest Germania. Why
Spoilers.
was why was it that the Romans never really could conquer Germania? And I'm going to leave this thought before we answer the question. Is after Varus, and remember, what we understand is
I
that
mean, was it the
legions
time
are
difference because it's been between, so again, to the comparison with Gaul, but it seemed kind of, I wouldn't say easy, but we had the famous, the fortress that Caesar built and etc. But what would what was the biggest difference here between the Battle of Teutoburg and the Battle of Gaul that Caesar had in
well,
Italy?
the impression I have with Caesar, okay, reading the Gallic War. Um, he had been fighting that war for the best part of a decade, 8 years, right?
Yeah,
58, I think, through 50. He had some excellent commanders who were able to execute commands or use initiative and do what they were doing. He had the ability to turn a crisis into a victory. I mean, it's just extraordinary. He would be able to take assessments of the situation and come up with a winning plan.
yeah,
He used intelligence.
yeah.
He was able to be very resilient to different challenges. I think the difference is, and of course, that's a continuing campaign, right? The difference with Varus is he is sort of at the end already several years of campaign. Don't forget, it started in 12 BC and had been going on pretty much every year through till about 8 or so BC, and it had been picked up again, and it was going on all the way from 4 through till 9. So there's a long period here of Roman activity, military activity within Germania. And by the time he is doing what he's doing, he may have understood that, as I say, it was a pacified kind of country. That the role of the army now was more one of building roads and doing police duties and these sorts of things, which he had seen, by the way.
Taxations.
Well, when he was in Syria and when he was in other places, those are the sort of things he would do. And if there's a revolt, he knew what to do to put them down. So, he wasn't new to that sort of stuff. For whatever reason or not, he decided not to heed the advice that had been given. I was at Segestes that actually had said, look, there's a plot, and you need to be aware of the plot. But he trusted Arminius, and Arminius must have been a very good
Yeah.
poker player, if you will, in order to be able to say, well, no problems over here, Clarence.
Can't read my, you can't
Yeah,
read my poker face.
but the point is, he was actually not probably in a war frame of mind, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Right. Caesar was always in a war frame of mind because he was leading a campaign. And I think it was only, in 5049 when that sort of pretty much came to an end, and he switches then into a different mode, whereas Varus is really there for pacification duties. It's a different kind of mission. And so the difference I think comes down to this is that the Romans, in underestimating their adversary, their combat doctrine, which was really masses of men, set piece battles, or sieges, this type of thing they tended to default to, is not what Germanic and Celtic tribes did. They were much more into ambushes and skirmishes and this type of thing. And the Romans could do that equally well, but here's a classic case. He's marching
Yeah.
a whole load of men through
Also, you have the
Germanic
famous
territory.
forest that you're not in an open area,
Yeah,
and the Romans didn't know how to fight in such tight places. Like you said, you
yeah.
open field. That was kind of their thing as
Yeah.
well.
So, if he had been using his commander in warfare mentality, there were protocols to do this. You'd actually have a vanguard and they would go out to scout and see what was ahead. And if there was, a half a day ahead, there was indicate he would come back and say, we know at this point, and then you'd plan where you're going to set up your camp, and then you'd fortify that camp, and then you'd actually get up early next morning, dismantle the camp, and then move forward, and so it moved forward. but he seems to have not done some of those things, which is what the Roman historians criticize him for. And ultimately, when faced with an opponent who is as smart as Arminius, Hermann, he's outwitted, and he shouldn't have been. He was a man who had some experience. And Joe Ball's written a book about Quintilius Varus and expands all of this. Is that to some degree he's been vilified and been made the scapegoat, right, for some pretty poor policy decisions anyway, which you could argue were happening. I mean, one of them, for example, is was the Roman approach to Germania a hurried one? They were so keen on relentlessly moving forward with this mission of conquering Germania. I mean, it started, like I said, in 12 BC. Augustus had lost Nero Claudius Drusus, but after that, Tiberius would run a successful campaign. Saturninus has run, Domitius Hannibarbus had got the army all the way back up to the Elbe, and so on. So the indications were, you keep going along this path, we will pacify this place. When the three legions are effectively wiped out, uh, the frontier falls back to the Rhine. But what's interesting is famously Augustus says, Quintus Varus gives me back my legions, and that day
Yeah.
becomes a day of nefastus. It's a day where no business can be, public business can be done. Um, but he doesn't
It,
abandon Germany. He sends Germanicus to finish the job.
yeah.
And he sent him in 13, and unfortunately in 14 Augustus dies, so we never see the end of that project in his lifetime.
But is it, as historians claim, that it kind of, and I'm gonna do a comparison to, the infamous Battle of Tours, and we discussed this in a few episodes ago, where, in our episode on Islamic Spain, how the Battle of Tours kind of is portrayed as this, the one that stopped, the Islamic expansion into Europe. But is it kind of is the Teutoburg First really the stopper for the, the Roman expansion into Germany? Is it kind of what the Battle of Tours was to Islamic Spain, to what, the it is to the Romans, and we know that, they would still have troops there. There would be kind of a never-ending battle between the German and the Romans. But what was this the decisive factor that would stop them expanding further into Germany, or is it really kind of again an over-exaggerated
Well,
idea? Idea?
so I can answer it this way. So we have the benefit of 2,000 years of, we can look back and
Yeah,
say, well, that's what happened. We're dealing with effectively like we are right now with a war or special military operations, expeditions,
yeah.
whichever you will, in Iraq, right? And it's day to day. And the commanders on the ground are responding to the mission they've been given, the resources they have, and their wits, their skill to be able to deal with the situation. Um, Clearly, Quintilius Varus failed in that respect, and in losing three legions, which were never reconstituted, left a permanent mark. Now, did the Roman Empire come rebounding back? Yes, because several years later, under Hadrian, I mean, they had like 30 legions, not 25. So it's not that the Roman Empire sort of stopped in its tracks.
A
I want to
few
repeat
years later,
but well, I want to make that. So Paterculus says in his Roman History 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, Caesar Augustus dispatched his grandson Germanicus to Germania to put an end to such traces of the war as still remained. He did that in 13, right? And Germanicus goes to Germany, and he does, in fact, after the mutiny, lead people into to fight. I think it's the Marsi or the one of those tribes. And Tiberius, even though Tiberius is advised by Augustus, supposedly on his deathbed, keep the empire within its rivers and mountains. Don't be trying any games to expand the empire. We did that, didn't work. Keep it as it is. Tiberius allows Germanicus, not for 1 but 2 years, to carry on a campaign in Germania. And you could say, he was a young, slightly inexperienced commander. I mean, this was a very large land army that he was in charge of. And in
and we
fact,
should might I add, sorry for interrupting, but might I add, we did discuss the Germanicus life in episode 64, which from 2022, which is crazy to think
yeah.
how many years
So,
ago that was.
yeah, and the story never gets old. But the point I'm making is that I don't think at this moment in time the Romans thought that Germany was lost.
Yeah,
You know, but the point is to end such traces as the war as still remained. the Romans still had Germanic allies, right? The Chauci, the Frisi, the Canonephates, for example, and certainly the Batavi were Roman allies. And in fact, all the way through to like the 60s AD, right? We're talking about, coming towards Nero into the Flavian period. The Canonephates and the Frisi are still providing tribute to the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating that we tend to think, well, the Romans fell back to the Rhine and drew a line and never again. But I think it was a lot more, um, I wouldn't say flexible, that wouldn't be the right term, but they were prepared to take calculated risks. So Germanicus is sent over. He does an expedition basically repeating what his father had done 15, 20 years before, pretty much following the same route. He goes to Teutoburg, they have a burying ceremony and all this kind of thing. It's only Tiberius in 16 AD that finally says, I think we've done what we're going to do. Let's close the file now. You come back. We've got a triumph for you and a consulship, and I got great plans. Come back. And Germanicus says, no, I just need a troop surge. Just one more go. One more go. We can fix this. Tiberius, who spent at least 10 years of his life in Germania, so he has a particularly hands-on view of the place and the people, understands the problems in a way that probably no other person actually of the time could do, says, no, my mind is made up. You better come back and celebrate your triumph and do the consulship, okay? And that's where Tiberius says, I'm actually going to do that, what my father, my adoptive father, the divine Augustus, had told me to do. And maybe it was smart advice, I should have kept it. And at that point, Germany becomes two Roman provinces. It becomes Germania Inferior, Germania Superior, which are basically carved out of the Belgic province of Gaul. And there's an Upper Germany, which goes up in the Alps, and Lower, which goes down towards the North Sea. And that's what the Romans refer to as Germany. It's two Roman provinces, and out of those comes Cologne and Mainz and Düsseldorf and some of the great cities that straddle the Rhine there. And half the centuries they've grown up as great cities of the world now, and they found their roots under Drusus the Elder. But even until you find, for example, the Romans were fighting battles at Hartshorn in around 235 AD under probably Maximinus Thrax. There were other skirmishes and other kinds of expeditions and battles going on. But what you find in the archaeology is evidence that the Romans are trading with the people across. It's almost as though they say, you know what, under Tiberius, he says, we tried the battle didn't work. I much prefer diplomacy. I'll use proxy wars if I have to. Rather than fight them myself, I'll have the two Germans, our friends will fight them, or we maybe provide them some stuff. Interesting enough, when one of the German tribes warriors, the war leaders, comes to Tiberius and said, look, if you provide the poisons, I can kill Arminius. And Tiberius
Mm.
says, that's not the Roman way. We like to see our enemy eye to eye and then we kind of duel them with the sword. No, you're not going to get any poisons out of me. Arminius is killed by his own people in around about 21 AD, because the people there apparently think he's grown too tyrannical, too autocratic, and they actually assassinate him. So that's an interesting kind of footnote there. But the Romans have a relationship with Germania for centuries. And what's absolutely fascinating, what Augustus had tried to do, which I think originally was simple, it was to neutralize the threat of Germans coming into the Roman Empire, principally the Sugambri, the Usipetes, and the Tencteri. And they actually did that because actually what happened was that the Sugambri ended up by being transferred over the other side of the River Rhine and actually became a Roman population. They became known as Hugerni. And actually, and the Ubi and the Treveri had done the same thing in years past, and they became good sources for Roman auxiliary troops, for example. And this idea of trading, I mean, the Romans didn't need to own the territory over there to get the stuff that was economically of value, the slaves, the amber, iron, and things of that type. And in fact, what we also know, now we started the conversation earlier, they provided troops anyway, because it turns out the Romans needed soldiers. About half the Roman Empire, so half the Roman army was auxiliary troops. So of a 300,000 man army, about 150,000 of those were either infantry, cavalry, or auxiliary cavalry, so infantry and cavalry. Uh, and amongst them were all manner of German nations. If you look through when you look at Roman cohortes or ally, you'll find all sorts of Germanic tribes are represented there. And I think what that tells you is there was a realization, probably under Tiberius, who'd actually seen there, was this idea that we can actually get all the benefits of having the good things that come out of Germania without actually having our troops there. And in
Mm.
fact, we can use their troops to help us actually guard against the people we don't want to have come in.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very interesting kind of, work with your friends to keep, the friend of my friend
Keep
is
your friends close, keep your enemies closer.
that. And I was also going to say the enemy of my friend is my friend or
Yeah,
something. So I think it's very interesting how there's a lot more nuance to the Roman story in Germania and Augustus, who'd started out with the idea, let's just conquer the place. It turned out it didn't work. It
yeah,
didn't work. And there's a whole bunch of reasons I'm exploring as to why that didn't work.
yeah. Now, we've been talking for over 2 hours now, and it's always enjoyable to talk Roman Julian history with you, but I think we're gonna end it up soon. And let's end it up with, and I know I'm probably skipping a few years, but let's talk about the final days of Augustus, and of course, the end of his life, where because he is one of the longest ruling emperors in Roman
He is
history,
the longest.
and
He's not one of
he's
them. He's
yeah,
the longest. Yeah.
and it's we have to talk about as well the final days where he's fragile and where he is, I know there's one quote that I want to use as well where he says, "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." And we talked about as well that he has several famous last words, such as the I found Rome in bricks and I left the city in marbles, as we talked about before as well. So let's talk about some of the final famous quotes that he supposedly is to have said, and how as well Livia is also by his side to the very end. And there, so like we said earlier, there seemed to be quite an affectionate. I don't imagine if it wasn't an affectionate relationship that Livia wouldn't be by his side. But she was according to sources. But so let's talk about the final days. At the end of the life, and of course, Tiberius' accession into a Roman Empire Roman Emperor going from Augustus as well.
So in 14 AD, Augustus has been probably the emperor, the princeps, for a whole generation. I think he started kind of in 27,
Yeah,
which is when he got that agreement with the Senate, and his accumulation of powers through 19 and all the rest of it. Pontifex Maximus and so on, his
I
various
mean, and
wars.
as well, we should
Uh,
say that it's maybe obvious, but it wasn't not 14 AD for the Romans. They had a different calendar, so just
that's
I'm just
yeah.
saying.
No, you're absolutely right. It was the year of the consuls, and I forget the name of the consul. He was 75 in that year, AD 14. He was harder of hearing. His voice was fainter. I think he had a lame leg. I mean, he'd had some battle scars from when he was in Illyricum many, many years before. And when he was at meetings of the Senate, he would actually have his grandsons read out the letters. And in fact, I think one of them was actually Germanicus ended up reading out his own report to the Senate, and it must have been quite something to actually see. Uh, so he's an older man, and I would imagine he worries about what happens after he goes. There had been near misses. He had almost died a couple of times in his life already, one of which was, I think, around about sort of 25, 26, something like that, BC. And he actually handed over his ring over to Agrippa at that point, and the assumption that that was coming and nominating him as a successor. But Augustus had actually already made preparations. He had written his Res Gestae, his things done, his book of achievements, if you like, and that would be carved on the sides of buildings and put on bronze tablets. And in fact, that's how we know his first take of history, if it were, what he wrote about what he thought he had done good. He had actually
Is the
kept a whole.
memoirs of Augustus still available, or are they lost to history?
So only the Res Gestae survive. His books of memoirs, no, they don't succeed. They don't survive at all, and that's a shame because we know there's like 14 volumes or something
Yeah.
of them. And this is always the tragedy. The only ones that we really have, which are written by the emperor, and so of course, Marcus Aurelius' meditations, and they're not
Yeah.
autobiographical. Biographical. It's a series of observations and quotes and things. Um, we know that Tiberius wrote memoirs. We know that Claudius wrote histories. I mean, we know that these people were literate. They wrote lots of things, and we know that Marcus Agrippa wrote things. But all we have of Augustus is the Res Gestae, which is effectively, you might say, a sort of first person. I did these things, and I rewarded the people this way, and I did those things, and I gave that stuff to my people. You know, it's a long document. The fact it survives at all is quite remarkable. It survives from a temple in Ankara, in Greek, and it's been translated. So the, the world that he had come in as a young man was very different to the one that he
Yeah.
left. And there's a very touching scene. I think it's in Suetonius. If not there, it's probably Cassius Dio, where as part of his, what is it, um, planning for the year 14, he goes on a road trip. He goes down to
Does he know the
Campania.
end is near at this point?
I would imagine he was always aware that he could die at any particular moment. I mean, like I say, he'd had some near misses, and he wasn't always a well person. He's very superstitious. He set up on a final sort of journey. I don't know if he thought of it as final, but it turned out to be his final. He goes to Campania, and he sort of meets with friends and pops into different cities. He crosses over on a ship, I think, with the idea of getting to one of the islands. I forget whether it was Capri or where. And as they're doing this, they're passing other boats and ships, and people on the boats see that it's Augustus and they wave. And they say, it's been great. You've given us all these opportunities. It's been so peaceful these last few years. I've been able to make my business work, and my kids are doing so great, and so on. And it's a very sort of poignant moment that you imagine that this man is 75 and he's not the fittest of people at this time to be getting this direct feedback from people, strangers who spontaneously tell him that stuff. So he goes to uh, Nola, I think it is, and that was the building I think his father grew up in. And on the route there, they've stopped into some towns, and there have been gymnastic games by the young kids in the towns, and they all make a big fuss of Augustus, and he likes those kinds of gymnastic exhibitions anyway, so it sort of suits him. And with him is Tiberius, I think also Thrasillus, who is Tiberius's astrologer, come Stoic advisor, and there's several other people, no doubt, and of course there's his wife Livia, and they have discussions at night, and they have dinner, and they talk about different things. And one of those evenings, he gets much frailer, but in the meantime, he sent Tiberius off. Look, I've got a final mission for you. You go into Illyricum. I need you to fix some of the things going on there. I know you can do it. Thanks very much. See you when you get back. And then, as Tiberius is literally on the ferry going over to Illyricum, a message reaches him that Augustus is gravely ill. So Tiberius has to spin back, get the next ferry over, go up the Via Appia, and take a detour to get to Nola. And he finds Augustus basically on his deathbed, and his slaves has to, keep his jaw up because he's no doubt weakening in the jaw, and he's been talking. They have a private conversation, the gist of which we don't really know much about, but probably consists of, I think these are the things you should do. But you've got to remember there was no line of succession in the way that there was an emperor position for Augustus to give Tiberius. Tiberius was already um, basically the man in terms of political powers that Augustus was. The only thing I think he didn't yet have, well, he did have the title of Augustus, of course, but the point is, he had, for example, the tribunician power. He'd been consul numerous times. He was already in command of the armies, pretty much, and so many other things that really he had all the layer cake of powers and titles, bar the one Augustus, that he effectively was doing the job Augustus had been doing. So when finally he dies, and he apparently says what you said, he also says to his wife some very, very sweet things, which have been recorded to the effect of, you've been my darling wife, and, never forget me type of
Yeah.
thing. Uh, and he dies, and there are some days, and it's very confusing that there's one piece which says that actually Tiberius hadn't yet arrived. The other piece says, yes, he had arrived, they'd had the conversation, so we're not even clear about those details. There's some people who think that Livia had actually suppressed the news because they had to get things done, preparations made, because this was explosive news. There were already, presumably, from what I recall, letters and messages had been written to the legionary commanders and to the deputy Augustus legates in the provinces. Basically, your standing orders are to, you know, basically keep watch, keep the frontiers, keep doing those things. Nothing has changed. But Tiberius at this time is not emperor, and that because there's no emperor to to give him, right? So when finally this is finally released to the public, I mean, there's national outpouring. I mean, kids had been born in 27 BC, and they were young men now going into their mature years, and to hear this is a bit like for me when I learned about the death of the Queen. I mean, she was the
Yeah.
only regent I'd ever known, and it was very moving to be part of that national outpouring of grief because
And now we
something that
have
had been.
old man King Charles who probably won't live for another 3, 4 years. Who knows?
Well, I'm just going to say long live the king because I think actually he's a king.
I'm
But
joking.
my point is though that in that time someone who'd always been there was on all the coins, was in all the sort of like edicts and mentioned in decrees of the Senate and all this sort of thing. Um, people kind of gossiped about him and the family. You mentioned Julian, all the other things going on. Very
Yeah.
much part of the Roman story at this time, and now we get this new man come in, and there's some. Well, what do you mean Tiberius is sort of, coming to the Senate and going to lead the funeral party? And we talked to this, I think, at great length in the one talk we had about Tiberius. But the days after Augustus dies are still not clear to us. And part of that is because I don't know that an official account was ever written, because it was a turning point. There were some people who felt with Augustus dying, the Roman Republic would pass back to something like Cicero would have approved, where the Senate reigned supreme and the people went back to voting and this sort of stuff. But that's
But
sort of
what
not
about
what happened.
what about some of the famous last words, that I said earlier, such as, I left the city, found a city in bricks and left it in marbles, or, if I did a good job, then applaud me. And he said other stuff that he has a lot of famous last words. As
Yeah,
are
you know,
these inventions that we think that they seem like they are more like inventions from historians. They wanted to try to portray him as this wise old emperor who final breath, go out dying in a blaze of glory in a
well,
way.
and so maybe, I mean, okay, that could be true. And it's possible that he may have written out things, I want people to know this.
Yeah.
Or he may have muttered it, and because he's probably fading over a few days, and he'd said lots of things, and people would remember what he said to them, right? And that would then sort of develop a life of its own. And some of these sayings were gathered together later, and we know, for example, Suetonius had access to the public records and letters and documents in the public records office, and therefore could actually sort of see some of these things. He chose to keep some of them in and leave some of them out. And I think it's very interesting that Tom Holland makes the point that Augustus had realized that in order to be successful as a Caesar, he had to be an actor, a man on the stage. And what better way to say that than the words of a performance artist, an actor, a pantomime actor, right? And
Yeah.
would say those if you've enjoyed my performance, give me your applause. I mean, that's what an actor apparently
Yeah.
would have said, and that fits with that kind of idea. It's a nice story. It changes him from being a sort of mafia boss into someone who's everybody's favorite grandfather, and everybody then he can then depart this world, and we were so much better for it. On the other hand, it puts Tiberius in a terrible position because now here's somebody that effectively has been pushed forward to continue the work, continue the project, because uh, the only person. there were a couple of people who might have been obvious to be successors, and one was Tiberius, who, to all intents and purposes, had been nominated by Augustus to do that. I mean, in fact, he was there, and he then arranges the funeral and all the rest of it, and has the will read out, and so on and so forth. But there's also that Agrippa Posthumus, remember, who's exiled in and the Pandatoria of Pontia. I forget which of those small islands is, and he is quickly assassinated. And the story is that at some point, Augustus has gone to visit with him and had a conversation. Some people thought that actually he was going to make him the successor. So when he dies, he'll be a guard will come and they will take him to Rome and they will declare him emperor. Well, actually, the opposite happens. The officers they actually assassinate him, and then the guilt gets the man blamed for that is Tiberius. And I came to the conclusion, having read the thing, is it was either done by arrangement with Augustus himself, he left instructions for that to happen, or Livia arranged for it to happen, so there was no question. Tiberius always denied it, and I've no reason to dispute it, frankly.
Well, I'm sorry, but sometimes when it's recording 2 hours, we do need a re-break once in a while, and we're back now. I'm so sorry for that. I know that for the listener, it doesn't seem like we had a break because we just paused the episode, but we do need. So if it seems weird, that's why we have some. But we've been recording it now for 2 hours now, and it's kind of still the normality when we have Lindsay on the podcast. So. Don't worry, you still have to listen to us a few more minutes. Don't worry, but yeah, we were talking about I think and for Jimmy, but it's been a long time for both of us, and we were talking about Augustus' death and his famous last words. So let's go on with some the famous last words and how reliable are these quotations that he has between and see you find the Sotenos book there, but how reliable are these final famous last words of Augustus?
Well, you're asking one of those questions that really scholars spend hours agonizing over. Like, can we trust any of the ancient sources? Is really a fundamental question. They're what we've got. For example, I'm looking at this is the Tom Holland translation of Suetonius,
Yeah.
The Lives of the Caesars, and this is a good recent translation. There are other ones. And what you were saying earlier, apparently what he says is that the play has been a good one. Then please clap your hands and let me leave the stage up to the sound of your applause. And what he's supposed to have said to his wife was, always cherish the memory of our marriage, Livia, for as long as you may live, and so farewell.
Yeah.
And as I say, I think the one quote, it sounds very plausible. I mean, it's a very showy sort of way for him to do it. He understood the value of having
I
people
mean,
write these
it's
things.
like the O2 Brute
Well,
quote,
yeah,
right?
except that he probably actually didn't say that. But anyway, that seems to be a
I mean, he
consensus.
was basically stabbed, so I just had time to say, those
Um,
words.
and in the case of what he said to his wife, I mean, they're lovely words, and you would hope that actually they had said that because they've been a lifelong couple, after
Yeah,
what was it, 38 BC, they've been a couple for a very, very, very long
yeah.
time. And I think what it is okay, there's an element there of managing last moments that are the last impressions, which in a sense become the first impressions when they're announced. So what happens is, as I said, I mean, the messages go out from Nola, which is where his father had actually died. He apparently died in the same bedroom that his father had died. I mean, it was very much a small family affair, you might say, but the ramifications, the shockwaves of this are very important. So when the body is prepared to be taken to Rome, it goes along the main road, and of course, there's probably going to be a Praetorian cohort at least involved in this, probably front and back maybe, and there's going to be riders going ahead, make way for the body of Caesar because he's still called Caesar or Augustus. The magistrates of the town come out because they want to accompany the body. I mean, they literally want to be pallbearers so they can then say, I was there. I carried the body of Augustus. It's very moving stuff. And this happens all the way through all the colonia, the municipia, and the towns and villages of the town. So there, it's very, very much a public grieving, people turning out in their black. and burning embers and things on altars all the way through. So it's a Roman Italian public of mourning, and then finally they arrive in Rome. The traditions require that the body is prepared, and they basically I leave it in one of the temples, and it's prepared and dressed and so on. And that there's an order in which the funeral will take place. So on the day, the body is brought to, I think it's the Forum Romanum, and there are speeches given. So Tiberius gives a speech. I think his son also gives a speech. Um, so it's very much, they call it a funebris laudatio. So what Tiberius gives, and this is also, I think, either recorded by Suetonius or Tacitus, where he basically says, this man was incredible. I mean, look at everything he did. He actually ran everything himself. The job that really should have been the job of many, he seemed to have this ability to do. And you can imagine the throngs of people in the Roman Forum. It's a long rectangular space with basilica halls on either side, one of which he'd built, the Basilica of Caius and Lucas. And you can imagine there were people crushed in the space and hanging from the balustrades and, probably hanging on the columns and the rostra and things, the very decorative architecture there, listening to all these words. And then the procession comprises, for example, they take out from the Senate House the golden Statue of Victory, which had been awarded him, and there were shields with his virtues on, and all this is taken out and ceremoniously marched. I think there are coins which show an effigy made of wax, which has Augustus. This is another Roman tradition, where the wax effigies of all the deceased in the family come out. They have hired mourners and they wear these masks. So, Julius Caesar would have shown up for the funeral, and Agrippa would have shown up for the funeral in masks and in costumes. And there were hired mourners and wailing and sort of all sorts of noise. And then there would be people in the queue who were in this vast parade who were also part of it. The Romans actually made fun of the dead people. They told
Yeah.
jokes about them, and they just basically character assassinated. It's all part of the Roman tradition. And there are, it's people, a long throng, and they all file along the Via Lata all the way through, finally to arrive at the mausoleum. At the mausoleum, the body is taken off and put on the pyre, which is called the ustrinum, and they ceremonially burn the body. And what happens is the Roman cavalry, the Praetorian Guard cavalry, have all their various awards they've been personally given by Augustus, and they throw these awards onto this pyre. I mean, an act of religious respect in a way. I mean, they're saying, "You gave me this, I give it back to you," sort of thing. And Livia stays the entire time there. And over about 4 days, it takes for this pyre of embers and the body to disintegrate. And they collect all the ashes, and they collect them, and they're oiled, as I understand it, put in an urn. And the Praetorian Guards there doing the work, and personal slaves and so on and so forth. And when the urn is ready, they ceremonially take it into the mausoleum, and they place it on the place that, Augustus has already chosen where he was going to die and be buried. And this was the final act in that long
Is he the
preparation.
first emperor to enter a mausoleum that Agrippa built? Is he the first to
Well,
enter there?
no, so Augustus built his own mausoleum, and he
Yeah.
built it like 20s BC, right? Ironically, Agrippa built his own sepulchre, but he didn't get to bury his body in it because Augustus insisted his ashes went in his mausoleum, along with his sisters and Marcellus and Nero Claudius Drusus
Yeah.
and an increasing number of people in his
I mean, it's a
family.
nice company to keep, I guess.
Well, it is extraordinary. I would like to go and see the new reconstructed, I mean, the repaired, conserved mausoleum, because from what I hear, the Italian authorities have done a very good job of it. I mean, I think what you've got there is, again, and outside are these two great obelisks, and on them are the res gestae, and these tell his official story. And it's amazing because, those have survived, not the columns, but the story has survived. If you go to the building adjacent to it, which is the Ara Pacis Augusti, which is inside of a modern building, you'll see on the wall outside that is a modern copy of the Res Gestae. And let's see if I can quite quickly put it up here. So I go there.
Put it up,
Um,
Jamie.
So it says, and this is the official word. Below is a copy of the acts of the deified Augustus by which he placed the whole world under the sovereignty of the Roman people and of the amounts which he expended upon the state and the Roman people, as engraved upon two bronze columns which have been set up in Rome. And this is where it starts.
Yeah,
At the age of 19, on my own initiative and at my own expense, I raised an army by means of which I restored the liberty of the Republic, which had been oppressed by the tyranny of a faction. And it goes on and on and on and on. And it's extraordinary that survives because this is his, it's a kind of autobiography. It's propaganda at another level. And it's a very Roman thing.
yeah,
Romans celebrating, look what I did, chest thumping stuff. And a lot of it is about military stuff, about victories. A lot of it's about money he gave
yeah.
and things he did and awards he was given. And he wrote it. So I think what he is doing there is controlling the narrative. And so you have to imagine that Rome in 14 AD is it's a sad place. I mean, Augustus, who has been this amazing figure in people's lifetimes, is now in his mausoleum. And all the greats are dead now, right? I mean, so for example, Agrippa's dead, and all of those people that were part of the evolution of the what we now think of as Roman Empire. And now it's all down to what the heck happens now, because there wasn't really a plan. And it's left to Tiberius with the Senate to work out what that is. And I know I wrote about this at length in my biography, and a lot of people seem to think that, well, he was very reluctant to take on the job. I think he actually understood what the job involved, and he'd said in the funeral address, it's a very big job, and several people should have been doing it. And in fact, what Tiberius says to the Senate is, I suggest several people should do this job. And they
Yeah.
say no. We want you to do it. And he negotiates. And where people see reluctance, I see a negotiator. I will do the job, but on my terms. And he does it for 22 years, pretty much following what Augustus had been doing for his 45 years.
Which
And
of
I
course you
think
can
what
listen to in our episode on Tiberius. Let me just find out, and I don't have to look it up because I don't remember what the episode number. So let me know just
yeah.
1 second. I
But by the way, you can
think
actually read the translation on Livius. If you go to
yeah,
livius.org, sources, content, Augustus Res Gestae. It's all there. Jona Lendering did a great job of actually recording all that for us. So
yeah.
I,
So
I think Augustus,
episode 245, Tiberius, Rival Emperor, is our episode with the where we discuss Tiberius, which is 2 hours, about 3 hours long. If you have the patience to listen to all of it, and I think
it's
we
a thrilling
don't.
story.
Oh, absolutely. We barely touched the tip of the iceberg as well in that episode because there's just so much to talk about. And there's even some more to talk about the justice, and we probably should have split it into a part series episode on Tiberius as well. And there's a good reason why we did this episode in 2 parts as well. So with that, I think we're gonna round it up there. There's a lot of stuff that we missed, of course, and that we probably will cover in future episodes about Augustus. And I do have a fairly this is not the last time we see Lindsay on this podcast, of course. We do have other topics that we want to talk about together, and we are going to very much enjoy those conversations for the future. But for now, you have written an kind of biography of Augustus as well, called Augustus, Man at the War. So where can people find that book? And the last episode, 245, where we talked about Tiberius in last summer, that it came out around April, May, I think, last year. That where can people find your recent biography and the book that you're working on now? When is it coming out? And of course,
Oh,
any other stuff that
that'll
you want to
be
share.
so. My latest book, Roman Conquests Germania for Pen and Sword, will probably be next year. I'm still going through that right now, and I am just finding it
You
fascinating
heard
because
it
I'm
here
learning.
first,
Uh,
folks.
I'm just learning so much about the latest in German archaeology. I mean, there were things just found in the last several weeks. There are things coming out that just weren't available to us 5 and 10 years ago, and I'm able as a news editor for ancient history and ancient warfare magazines, able to bring into the books. I'm pleased about that. But you can go to my website, Lindsay Powell, or lindsay-powell.com, and you'll find everything I've written on there. There's some downloadable articles from different sources. But I think it's a subject that endlessly fascinates the
Yeah.
Roman world. I mean, some of the things we see are the same issues today, which people then wrestled with, which are power and how you exercise power. And that thing is you declare war on a nation, and there are things that happen that you didn't plan for have
Mm.
happen. And it's always fascinating to look into the past to see what analogies and warnings and lessons can be learned.
Where can people find you on social media, or if they have further questions about what we
So
discussed
again,
today,
you
and of
can go
course
right
other
down to the
episodes
bottom
that
of
we have
my
done.
you can go right down to the bottom of my website. You'll find them on there. So I'm on X, which is Lindsay underscore Powell. You can find me on Blue Sky, which is Lindsay Powell at social. I forget how that's constructed. I'm on Facebook, Lindsay Powell author, and I think that's about it. The three is quite enough.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you as always. We love having this conversation. This is not the last time you have seen Lindsay. Like I said on this podcast, we have great plans for future episodes as well. He's stuck with me as of yet, to put it that way. Stay tuned for more Lindsay in the future. This has been Well That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Lindsay this week. And check out the other episodes we've done. We've done one on the first episode he did was way back when in 2022 on Germanicus, episode 64. And we have done one on Agrippa. We done two-part episode on the Julio-Claudian dynasty. We also done one on Tiberius, of course, which we mentioned. So check out all the other episodes we have done together and more to come. And yeah, we are, like I said, we are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. If you're on Spotify, give us 5 stars and leave a comment as well. If you're on YouTube, leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts, leave a review and give us 5 stars. That would be nice. Or if you hate this podcast, give us one. It's a free world, at least in my country so far. And if I still have a say. And yeah, this has been Well That Aged Well. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned. Fun. We definitely should have some episodes for your likings that you might find enjoyable. My name is Alan. This has been Well That Aged Well, and I'll see you next time.